Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I am very glad you're here tonight. Get comfortable if you can. Let your shoulders drop a little. Maybe you have a blanket nearby, maybe a warm drink, maybe you are listening from a room that has finally gone quiet after a long day. Wherever you are, I hope you can settle in, because tonight we're stepping into a war that many people think they already understand, and then looking at the part of it that almost never receives the same attention. When most people hear the word Spanish-American War, they picture a short, dramatic conflict from 1898. They think of headlines in crowded newspapers, patriotic parades, the sinking of the USS Maine, Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, cavalry charges, naval guns, and the quick collapse of Spain's remaining empire in the Caribbean and the Pacific. It is remembered as a compact war, a fast war, a war that seemed to move at the speed of telegraph wires and newspaper presses. The fighting itself lasted only a matter of weeks, and by the end of that summer, the political map of the world had shifted. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines all stood at the centre of a new American age. But that is not the whole story. It is not even the most haunting part of the story. Because while soldiers trained, boarded ships, marched through tropical heat, and waited for orders, another enemy had already entered the war. It did not wear a uniform. It did not carry a rifle. It did not announce itself with artillery. It moved through drinking water, contaminated food, overcrowded tents, muddy camps, filthy latrines, damp uniforms, mosquito bites, and the ordinary human habit of underestimating what cannot be seen. It spread quietly, then suddenly. It filled hospital tents. It turned strong young men into feverish patients. It took hold in American camps before many soldiers had even come close to a Spanish battlefield. And by the time the war was over, disease had killed far more American service members than enemy fire had. That is the story we're going to sit with tonight. Not the war as it appeared in patriotic illustrations. Not the war as politicians wanted it remembered. Not even the war as soldiers imagined it while leaving home with polished buttons and fresh uniforms. We're going to follow the war from a different direction. Through fever wards and camp kitchens, through reports written by overworked physicians, through the long rows of cots where men shivered beneath blankets despite summer heat, through the uneasy realization that the real danger was not always across the battlefield. Sometimes it was already in the water bucket. Sometimes it was in the stew. Sometimes it was in the trench dug too close to the camp. Sometimes it was in the air around a swamp at dusk. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? A bedroom, a sofa, a kitchen after everyone else has gone to sleep, maybe a train, maybe a quiet shift somewhere with the lights turned low. I always like imagining that these stories are travelling outward into rooms I will never see, keeping company with people I will never meet. And while you settle in, think for a moment about how you picture danger. Most of us are trained to notice what is loud. A siren, a crash, a shouted warning, a visible threat. But history has a way of reminding us that the most devastating things are not always the ones that arrive noisily. Sometimes they come softly, almost politely, and by the time everyone agrees they are dangerous, the damage is already underway. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you enjoy slowing down with history and looking carefully at the lives behind familiar events, it would mean a great deal if you subscribed and gave this video a like. There is no rush to do it. Let the story earn it. Do it whenever something here catches your attention or makes you see the past differently. Now let us go back to the spring of 1898. The United States had declared war on Spain after months of rising tension over Cuba, the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, and a public atmosphere thick with outrage, sympathy for Cuban independence, and national ambition. Volunteers rushed to enlist. State regiments filled. Young men who had grown up hearing stories of the Civil War from fathers and grandfathers now believed their own chance had arrived. Some imagined glory. Some imagined travel. Some probably imagined both. The war looked, at first like an event that would be decisive, honourable, and perhaps even brief enough that a man might return home before life had changed too much around him. And in one sense, the war was brief. The major fighting unfolded quickly. American forces won notable victories in Manila Bay and Santiago de Cuba. Hostilities were suspended by August 1898. Officially, this conflict became one of those wars that later generations could summarise in a few confident sentences. It began in April. It was mostly over by August. The United States emerged with a new overseas empire. Spain's old imperial power broke apart further. The century turned a corner. Yet wars do not feel brief to the people trapped inside them, and they do not unfold only where bullets fly. Imagine one of those volunteer soldiers in the early weeks of mobilization. He might be 18 or 22 or 30. He comes from Ohio, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Iowa, New York, Wisconsin. He arrives at an encampment with thousands of others. The air smells of trampled grass, horse manure, sweat, leather, smoke from campfires and damp canvas after rain. There is shouting everywhere. Officers trying to impose order. Men joking too loudly because they are nervous. Cooks working over crude field kitchens. Lines forming for rations. More recruits arriving every day. The ground churns into mud around the tents. Water supplies strain under sudden demand. Latrines are dug, but not always well, not always far enough away, not always used properly. Flies move freely between waste and food. Men drink from sources they should not trust because they are thirsty, and because no one has yet convinced them that something clear can still be deadly. This is the part of war that recruitment posters do not show. The United States Army of 1898 was expanding rapidly, and its medical system was not prepared for the scale of that expansion. The army had experience managing small frontier posts and limited regular forces. It was not ready for enormous temporary camps filled with inexperienced volunteers from across the country, gathered quickly, housed imperfectly and supplied unevenly. The result was not merely discomfort, it was a public health crisis. Army medical historians later described typhoid fever, not some exotic tropical illness, as the greatest threat faced by many American troops during the war, especially in crowded camps inside the United States. Typhoid fever is not dramatic at first. That is part of what made it so dangerous in 1898. A soldier might begin with a headache, fatigue, aching limbs, a low fever, maybe a vague sense that his stomach was not right. In a military camp, where nearly everyone was tired and uncomfortable, symptoms like that could be dismissed. Men had marched. They had drilled in heat. They had slept poorly. Of course they were worn down. But then the fever deepened. Weakness set in. Some developed severe abdominal symptoms. Days passed. More men fell sick. The hospital tent filled. Then another. Then another. And what had seemed like scattered illness revealed itself as an epidemic, moving through the army's own gathering places. The numbers are difficult to read even now. More than 20,000 American soldiers contracted typhoid fever during the war. More than 2,000 died from it, according to National Archives material and Army medical histories. In the large assembly camps, typhoid accounted for an overwhelming share of disease deaths. This means that for many families the telegram did not come because a son had fallen in a charge or been struck by a Spanish bullet. It came because he had become sick in camp, sometimes without ever leaving the United States. There is something especially unsettling about that. A battlefield death fits the old language of war, grim as it is. It can be framed in terms people recognize: duty, courage, sacrifice. But disease deaths in a training camp are harder to absorb. They expose weakness in systems. They reveal mistakes made before the fighting truly begins. They remind us that armies can be endangered by their own organisation, by poor planning, by ignorance, by the simple failure to protect bodies from filth. A rifle can be aimed. A shell can be heard. Contaminated water has no warning sound. The Spanish-American War came at a strange moment in medical history. Germ theory had already transformed scientific understanding. Doctors increasingly understood that microorganisms cause disease. Advances in antiseptic surgery had changed the treatment of battlefield wounds. In fact, the medical handling of combat injuries in 1898 was far better than it had been during the Civil War. But knowledge did not automatically become practice everywhere it was needed. The prevention of disease in large camps required discipline, infrastructure, inspection, and a kind of logistical imagination that the mobilizing army often lacked. Physicians could understand infection in theory, and still watch helplessly as sanitation failed in practice. This gap between what was known and what was done matters. It matters because history is full of disasters that were not caused by complete ignorance, but by partial knowledge applied too slowly, too unevenly, or too late. In 1898, the United States was modern enough to fight across oceans with steamships, telegraphs, railroads, and modern rifles. It was modern enough to wage a short overseas war with astonishing speed. But in too many camps, it was not yet modern enough to keep waste away from food, to keep water safe, to isolate the sick effectively, or to take invisible infection as seriously as visible wounds. And this is before we even reach Cuba. Because once American troops moved into the Caribbean, disease took on additional forms. There were illnesses associated with the tropics that soldiers feared intensely, particularly yellow fever and malaria. The climate, the rain, the standing water, the exhaustion of campaigning, and the presence of mosquitoes made the environment itself feel hostile. Soldiers who survived battle could fall ill days later. Units that won victories on paper could become physically weakened to the point that they were barely able to function. The Army's medical crisis was not one single outbreak. It was a chain of vulnerabilities, each one revealing how fragile a force could become when disease gained momentum. Yet the most important irony remains this. The illness that devastated American troops most severely during the Spanish-American War was not primarily the tropical fever people imagined waiting in Cuba. It was typhoid, spreading through the camps created by the United States itself. It was the disease of crowding, poor sanitation, contaminated supplies, and human negligence. It was a homegrown catastrophe inside a war that popular memory often pictures as taking place somewhere far away. Let's pause with that for a moment. Thousands of young men put on uniforms in 1898 expecting to confront Spain. Many of them instead confronted dehydration, delirium, high fever, weakness so severe they could not rise from their cots, and the anxious faces of nurses and doctors who understood that too many patients were arriving too quickly. In some camps, illness became part of the daily background. Men watched comrades disappear from drill lines, then from tents, then from the living altogether. Letters home took on a different tone. Families waiting for news from the front received reports from hospitals. Burial records accumulated. The National Archives still holds documents related to the burial expenses of soldiers who died in these outbreaks. A dry administrative phrase that quietly conceals entire households in mourning. That is one of the reasons this story deserves to be told carefully. Because the phrase disease killed more than combat can become a statistic people repeat without feeling. It sounds tidy, it sounds like a fact in a textbook margin, but inside that sentence are hundreds of tents, thousands of letters, endless cups of water carried to feverish men, families reading names in newspapers, doctors trying to keep order in conditions that had already slipped beyond easy control. Inside that sentence is a war whose most persistent enemy did not sign treaties, did not surrender cities, and did not care who believed the campaign would be glorious. There is also something very human in how long it can take institutions to accept a truth that is becoming obvious in front of them. At first, illness can be explained away. A few cases are unfortunate, a cluster is coincidence, a surge is temporary. Eventually the pattern becomes impossible to deny. This happened in 1898. The scale of typhoid infection forced investigation. The US Army Typhoid Board, led by Walter Reed, was formed to study how the disease had spread through military camps. Its work would become a major turning point in understanding and reforming military sanitation. What began as a wartime embarrassment became part of a larger transformation in how armies thought about prevention, hygiene, camp design, and the responsibility to protect soldiers from disease before they ever reached combat. But we are not there yet. Not tonight. Not quite. For now, we are standing at the edge of the story, before the board convenes, before the reports are written, before officials begin tracing routes of contamination and documenting failures in camp sanitation. We're standing in the early weeks of a war that appears from the outside to be unfolding briskly and successfully. Flags are waving, regiments are gathering, newspapers are roaring. The country is looking outward toward Cuba and the Philippines. And meanwhile, inside the camps, the real casualty lists are beginning in a much quieter way. A soldier coughs in the night, another cannot keep food down, another misses drill because he is too weak to stand. A surgeon records the case, then another case, then another. At first there is still optimism. Men recover from sickness all the time, but the weeks pass, the tents remain crowded, the water remains suspect, and the sick lists grow longer. The army is learning, by painful experience, that victory in battle does not guarantee survival in war. This is where we begin, with a conflict remembered for speed, but marked by slow fevers, with an army preparing to fight abroad while being weakened at home, with a nation watching its soldiers march toward a visible enemy, not yet understanding that the deadliest force in the war would often arrive without a uniform, without a sound, and without needing to cross any battlefield at all. In the late summer of 1898, when the fighting was almost over and the United States was already beginning to understand that it had won, John Hay wrote a private letter to Theodore Roosevelt and used the phrase that would follow the Spanish-American War for generations. It had been, he said, a splendid little war. The words were not meant for a monument. They were not carved into stone by some public committee. They were one man's private judgment, written at the end of a conflict that had moved quickly, produced dramatic victories, and seemed to confirm nearly everything Americans wanted to believe about themselves at that particular moment. Yet the phrase stayed because it captured the way the war looked from a distance. Short, decisive, successful, almost neat. A war that began in April and had effectively run its course by August. A war that made headlines, created heroes, and pushed the United States into the front rank of imperial powers before many Americans had quite grasped what that would mean. But there is a problem with neat wars. They are usually neat only when viewed from far enough away. Move closer and the shine begins to dull. Stand not in the office where the letter was written, not in the newspaper room where editors chose their triumphant words, not even on the reviewing stand where flags lifted in the breeze and bands played for returning soldiers, but in the camps where the army gathered before it sailed. Stand there long enough and the war begins to smell different. It smells of canvas and sweat, wet wool, horse droppings, grease from frying meat, stagnant water, and human waste covered badly with loose soil. It sounds different too. Not the clean crack of rifles or the blast of naval guns, but coughing in the night. Boots sinking into mud, mess pans scraping, flies gathering around uncovered food, men calling for water, orderlies moving between hospital tents, and surgeons asking how many more cots can be found before morning. That is where the darker enemy was waiting. The phrase "splendid little war" is not false, exactly. That is what makes it so useful and so dangerous. From the point of view of national strategy, it was brief and astonishingly successful. Spain's Atlantic and Pacific fleets were defeated. American forces took Manila Bay, fought in Cuba, occupied Puerto Rico, and forced Spain to the negotiating table. The conflict helped transfer Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to American control, and place Cuba under American occupation after Spain's withdrawal. In diplomatic terms, this was a dramatic outcome for a country that, only a generation earlier, had been consumed by its own civil war. In public memory, the speed of the victory made it easy to package the whole thing as proof of rising American strength. Yet soldiers do not live inside diplomatic summaries. They live inside bodies. Bodies get thirsty. Bodies need clean water. Bodies weaken under heat. Bodies carry bacteria from one place to another without understanding what they are doing. Bodies sleep too close together when camp space is crowded. Bodies stand in line for food, while flies move freely between latrines and kitchens. Bodies become armies, and when armies are gathered too quickly, fed unevenly, housed badly, and moved under pressure, the body becomes the first battlefield. This is the part of the Spanish-American War that begins before the famous fighting, before San Juan Heights, before the surrender of Santiago, before the songs and the engravings and the stories told later around parlour tables. It begins in mobilisation. It begins with enthusiasm, which is a wonderful thing in a parade and a dangerous thing in military planning. In April 1898, the United States suddenly needed to transform patriotic feeling into a functioning army. Thousands of volunteers poured into service, regular army units prepared to move, governors, officers, quartermasters, surgeons, cooks, railroad men and clerks all had to help turn civilian bodies into military units, with almost no time for correction once mistakes began. The country had energy. It had confidence. It had newspapers ready to celebrate. What it did not have was a modern mass mobilization system equal to the sudden pressure being placed upon it. Few American officers in 1898 had experience handling large bodies of troops in the field. The Civil War was more than 30 years in the past. The small professional army that remained after it had spent much of its time in scattered posts, not in huge assembly camps containing thousands of inexperienced volunteers. One military medical account later observed that the army had to assemble and launch an expeditionary force toward Cuba in only a few weeks, while many volunteers, impatient to reach the fighting before the war ended, ignored or resisted the rudimentary sanitary measures available to them. That impatience matters. It tells us something about the mood in those camps. Men were afraid of missing the war. They were less afraid of the camp itself. Imagine that for a moment. A young volunteer arrives expecting danger later. Danger will come after transport, after landing, after marching toward the Spanish lines. Danger will wear the shape he has been taught to recognize: rifle fire, artillery, ambush, a hill that must be taken, a blockhouse on the ridge. He does not arrive thinking that the barrel of drinking water near camp may matter more than the Spanish army. He does not imagine that a fly landing on his supper has any connection to the casualty list. He does not think of the latrine as a military position that must be managed with the discipline of a fortification. He wants a rifle, he wants orders, he wants motion. He does not want a lecture about drainage. That is one of the oldest mistakes in military history. Armies prepare emotionally for battle and then discover physically that disease has been preparing for them. The Spanish-American War was not unusual in this broad pattern. For most of human history, disease killed more soldiers than combat did. Camps were perfect engines of infection. They brought together young men from many communities, placed them under stress, changed their diets, exposed them to unfamiliar pathogens, strained water supplies, and created waste at a scale that ordinary settlements had not prepared to manage. But 1898 was supposed to be different, or at least closer to different. This was not the Middle Ages. It was not the age of vague miasmas and helpless guessing, although older habits of thought still survived. By the 1890s, germ theory had already reshaped medicine. Physicians increasingly understood that specific microorganisms cause specific diseases. Antiseptic surgical methods had improved the treatment of wounds. Military medicine was no longer working in complete darkness, and still the camps sickened. That is what makes the story so frustrating. The Army's medical failure in 1898 was not simply a story of ignorance. It was a story of knowing just enough to be responsible, and not yet being organised enough to act on that knowledge consistently. A surgeon might understand that contaminated water could spread typhoid. That did not mean a camp had enough clean water. An officer might be told that sinks, the army term for latrines, had to be placed and maintained properly. That did not mean every company enforced the rules. Medical officers could recommend improvements. That did not mean they had the authority, supplies, or cooperation to make them happen quickly. Knowledge had entered the room, but it had not yet taken command. This is where typhoid fever becomes the centre of the story. Typhoid was not exotic. It did not require jungles. It did not need tropical mystery. It was a disease of human waste contaminating food and water, and the assembly camps of 1898 gave it opportunities everywhere. National Archives material on burial records from the war describes just how destructive typhoid became among personnel stationed at training camps in the United States, noting a series of soldiers who died of typhoid rather than combat. Army medical history later made the point even more plainly. While American troops were defeating Spain in Cuba, Puerto Rico and the Philippines, disease was devastating those who remained in the United States, and the greatest threat was not an imported tropical disease but typhoid in huge crowded camps, where sanitation was poorly understood or poorly enforced. There is a grim irony in that. The popular imagination looked south toward Cuba and thought of fever. Yellow fever had a terrifying reputation. Malaria was expected. Tropical disease haunted the military imagination. These fears were not foolish. Disease in Cuba would indeed become a major concern. But the epidemic that tore through many American units had already found them before the tropics did. It came not from some distant swamp, but from the Army's own temporary cities. It came through carelessness multiplied by numbers. A camp may look orderly from a hill. Rows of tents, flags, drill fields, horses tied in lines. Smoke from cook fires rising in the morning, men moving at command. From a distance, a camp can look like discipline made visible, but sanitation lives in details, and details are where large organisations often fail. How far is the latrine from the kitchen? Which way does rainwater run? Are the sinks covered after use? Are the water barrels clean? Are the cooks washing utensils properly? Are sick men isolated early, or do they remain near their comrades until the disease is already spread? Are flies controlled, or are they treated as an unavoidable nuisance? Does the company officer care enough to enforce rules that bored and restless volunteers find irritating? Does anyone understand that a spoon, a boot, a hand, a bucket, and a fly can all become part of the same chain? Now put that inside an army racing toward a war that everyone believes may end quickly. The hurry mattered. Men who thought the conflict would be over before they arrived had little patience for careful camp construction. Officers feared delay. Politicians feared criticism. Newspapers wanted movement. Citizens wanted action. Volunteer units wanted to prove themselves. In that atmosphere, sanitation could feel like hesitation. A clean camp required time, labour, and a willingness to treat preventive work as military work. But shoveling proper drainage, relocating latrines, policing trash, boiling water, inspecting kitchens, and isolating illness did not look heroic. It looked fussy. It looked slow. It looked like the sort of thing a man could worry about after the army had reached the real war. Disease took advantage of that attitude. Think of how a single case could become many. One infected soldier carries typhoid bacteria in his body. Perhaps he's not yet very ill. Perhaps he uses a poorly maintained latrine. Rain comes. The soil softens. Drainage carries contamination toward a water source, or flies move from waste to food, or a cook's hands are not clean. The bacteria reach another soldier, then another. Days pass before symptoms fully reveal what has happened. By the time the first men are obviously sick, the disease has already travelled beyond them. This delay is one reason infection is so frightening. A bullet announces itself at once. Typhoid hides inside time, and the symptoms did not remove men from danger quickly enough. Each soldier might feel unwell and still stay with his unit. He might blame the heat, the food, the drilling, the nerves of waiting. He might not report to the surgeon until the fever had taken hold. In a culture where young men wanted to appear strong, admitting sickness could feel like weakness. In a volunteer regiment full of men eager not to miss glory, illness could be denied until denial was impossible. Then the hospital tent received him, and perhaps he found there men from his own company already lying under blankets. The war that seemed bright in the newspapers was darker in those tents. It is worth remembering how the public saw the conflict as it began. Newspapers had spent months stirring emotion over Cuba and Spain. The explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor became a rallying point. Sympathy for Cuban suffering mixed with anger, nationalism, sensational journalism, and strategic ambition. The war appeared to offer moral purpose and national opportunity at once. That combination is powerful. It lets a country tell itself that it is acting both nobly and successfully, both compassionately and forcefully. In 1898, many Americans believed they were helping liberate Cuba from Spanish rule. Many also believed the United States was ready to claim a larger place in the world. These motives did not cancel each other. They sat together uneasily, and the war moved forward under both. For a volunteer leaving home, however, the motives may have been simpler: adventure, duty, the chance to be part of something. A uniform can turn an ordinary street into a stage. Families came to see men off. Bands played. Women gave flowers. Local newspapers printed names. Whole communities invested pride in their regiments. Some men probably feared they would never see battle because victory might come too soon. That's another haunting detail. Men rushed toward the army partly because they worried the war would be over before they had a chance to be endangered by it. Then, the danger changed shape. There is a very particular sadness in reading about soldiers who died in camps far from the fighting. A man leaves home with the emotional weight of war around him. His family worries about Spanish bullets, tropical battlefields, the sea crossing, the unknown. Then he becomes ill in Georgia, Florida, Virginia, Pennsylvania, or some other training ground. The telegram does not say he fell while charging a hill. It does not say he died aboard a ship under fire. It says fever. It says hospital. It says remains. It says arrangements. Bureaucracy takes over where glory was expected. One source on the war's disease mortality states the stark imbalance plainly. Thousands of soldiers died from disease during a conflict lasting only a few months, with many of those deaths occurring while men were still in the United States. The same account gives the commonly cited contrast that the army suffered hundreds of combat deaths, but thousands from disease, and that nearly 3/4 of disease deaths happened stateside. Exact totals vary by category and accounting method, but the pattern does not. Disease was the greater killer. It was not close. This should change the way we imagine the word enemy. The Spanish army was real. Spanish soldiers fought and died. Spanish officers made decisions. Spanish defences mattered. American battlefield victories were not imaginary. But war has more than one enemy. There is the declared enemy, the one named in speeches and treaties, and then there is the enemy created by conditions: heat, mud, hunger, insects, bacteria, bad water, bad planning. The first enemy gives a war its title. The second often gives it its casualty list. The soldiers did not always understand this at first, but many came to feel it. Men could see comrades who had never been wounded become weaker than any wound might have made them. They could see hospital tents expanding. They could hear rumours pass from company to company. Typhoid in this regiment, fever in that one, men sent home, men buried. A sick camp develops its own weather. Even the healthy begin to move under the shadow of illness. Every headache becomes suspicious. Every stomach pain asks a question. Every cup of water looks a little different once men realise water can carry death. And still, the public story pushed forward. That contrast is important. In public, the war was becoming a narrative of national arrival. The United States had defeated an old European empire. Its navy had performed spectacularly. Its soldiers, despite supply problems and suffering, had fought with courage. Theodore Roosevelt emerged as a famous figure, his Rough Riders becoming one of the most enduring symbols of the conflict. American expansion into overseas territories seemed to supporters like proof that the nation had stepped into a larger destiny. For those inclined to celebrate, the war was convenient. It was brief enough to remember easily and successful enough to mythologize quickly. Disease does not fit easily into myth. A cavalry charge can be painted. A naval battle can be diagrammed. A surrender can be photographed. Fever is harder. A man lying under a damp blanket with dry lips and half-focused eyes does not serve the same public purpose. A latrine dug too near a water source is not the image a nation chooses for itself. The work of nurses, surgeons, orderlies, cooks and sanitation officers disappears behind the larger drama. Families remember their dead, but public memory sorts deaths into categories, and the deaths that embarrass the machinery of war are often softened, minimised, or treated as unfortunate background. But they were not background to the men who died. They were not background to the mothers who received letters after symptoms had already turned grave. They were not background to the men assigned to bury comrades. They were not background to surgeons who understood that the army's losses were being written not only by Spanish weapons, but by American conditions. And they were not background to the later reformers who studied what had gone wrong and tried to make sure the same disaster would not repeat itself in the same way. This is one reason the Spanish-American War stands at a crossroads in military medicine. It belongs partly to an older world, where armies expected disease to be terrible and often accepted its destruction with a certain fatalism. But it also belongs to a newer world, where scientific medicine was becoming strong enough to accuse systems of failure. The typhoid epidemics in the camps led to investigation, and the work of Walter Reed, Victor Vaughan, and Edward Shakespeare on the origin and spread of typhoid in military camps became part of a wider reckoning. The conclusion was not merely that disease had happened. Disease always happened. The deeper conclusion was that much of it had been preventable. Preventable is a heavy word. It is heavier than tragic. Tragic can mean unavoidable. Preventable means someone, somewhere, might have done something differently. It means the dead become evidence. It means every bad camp, every ignored warning, every poorly placed latrine, every contaminated water source, every crowded tent line becomes part of a moral inventory, not necessarily because individuals were cruel. Many were overworked, inexperienced, overwhelmed, or trapped inside systems too weak for the crisis. But preventable death asks more of history than sympathy. It asks for responsibility. And yet we should be careful not to make the men of 1898 sound foolish in a way that flatters us too easily. It is tempting to look back and say they should have known. In some cases, yes, they should have. In other cases, they were living through a transition in knowledge and practice that was messier than hindsight allows. Germ theory did not instantly clean every camp. Scientific understanding did not automatically produce enough trained personnel, proper equipment, disciplined enforcement, or public patience. The lessons that seem obvious after disaster often become obvious because disaster has written them so clearly. That is one of the quiet truths of this war. The Spanish-American War was small in duration, but large in consequence, not only geopolitically, but medically. It showed the United States that a modern army could not be judged only by its weapons or courage. It had to be judged by its water supply, its waste disposal, its hospital capacity, its transportation of the sick, its food inspection, its command discipline, and its willingness to treat sanitation as strategy. The war's darker enemy forced the army to confront the fact that the health of soldiers was not separate from military effectiveness. It was military effectiveness. A regiment weakened by fever cannot march well. A camp full of sick men cannot train well. A hospital overwhelmed by preventable disease cannot care properly for battle wounds. A transport ship carrying infected men does not merely move troops, it moves illness. An army that ignores disease is not being tough, it is giving strength away. Now return for a moment to that bright phrase, splendid little war. One can understand why it appealed. The war looks splendid to those measuring territory gained, fleets defeated, prestige increased, and diplomatic outcomes secured. It looked little because the formal fighting ended quickly. But from the perspective of a fever ward, nothing about it was little. From the perspective of a family burying a son who never reached the battlefield, nothing about it was splendid. From the perspective of a doctor watching typhoid move through young bodies in camp after camp, the war looked less like a clean national triumph, and more like a warning delivered in human form. This warning did not arrive all at once, it accumulated, a sick list here. A burial there, a camp rumour, a newspaper notice, a medical report, a grieving household, a surgeon's frustration, a board of inquiry, a reform proposed later. That is how many historical truths become visible, not in one dramatic revelation, but through repetition. The same mistake appearing in different places until it can no longer be dismissed as local misfortune. The same fever in regiment after regiment. The same sanitary failures. The same discovery that war, even a victorious one, can expose a nation's weaknesses as clearly as its strengths. So as we move deeper into this story, keep two images beside each other. The first is the bright public war. The flags, the speeches, the newspaper illustrations, the young volunteers standing straight in their uniforms, the belief that history had opened a door and America was walking through it. That image is real. It mattered. It shaped the age. The second is quieter. A line of tents after rain. A barrel of water no one quite trusts. Flies over a mess area. A soldier lying awake because the man beside him has been coughing and muttering for hours. A surgeon stepping into the morning light, already knowing there will be more cases today. A camp that looks like preparation for war, while already becoming part of the war itself. Between those two images, the story of disease in the Spanish-American War begins to take its proper shape. Not as a footnote, not as an unfortunate side effect, not as a sad statistic attached to a victorious campaign. It was central. It moved with the army, weakened it, embarrassed it, taught it, and killed in numbers Spanish weapons never approached. The war marched under bright banners, but beside it marched something darker, patient and perfectly adapted to human haste. Before a great many of those men ever saw Cuba, before they crouched behind a stone wall or pushed through brush under fire, before they learned what Spanish bullets sounded like passing overhead, their bodies were already being tested in another way. The testing ground was not a battlefield. It was the camp. Rows of tents pitched across open fields, temporary roads pressed into dirt by wagons and boots, supply depots that never seemed to contain quite enough of what was needed, cook fires burning from early morning, horses stamping near picket lines, men drilling, sweating, joking, writing home, grumbling about food, and slowly learning that army life was not the same thing as patriotic excitement. The camps were meant to prepare them for war. Instead, in several places, they became one of the war's first disasters. This is one of the easiest parts of the Spanish-American War to overlook, because it lacks the drama of an invasion. A training camp does not sound dangerous in the way a battlefield does. It sounds provisional. It sounds like a waiting room. Men gather there, learn their formations, get inspected, receive orders, and then move on to the real story. But in 1898, those camps were not simply places where soldiers waited. They were places where disease multiplied. They were crowded, hurriedly organised, often poorly supplied, and in many cases run by officers and physicians who had never before managed such large masses of men under field conditions. The medical department had less than 2 months to train new personnel and create hospital and evacuation systems before the sick lists began to rise. The army was expanding faster than its systems could adapt. The soldiers themselves often arrived from state assembly points already carrying illness, although nobody fully understood that at first. Typhoid fever was present in civilian life across the United States in 1898, and hurried mobilization meant that infected men could enter federal camps before symptoms became obvious. Army medical history later emphasized that this was exactly the kind of environment in which typhoid could seed itself quickly and then spread with frightening speed if preventive measures failed. The tragedy was not only that sick men arrived, it was that the camps were arranged in ways that helped disease travel farther once it got there. At first, many officers did not see what was happening. They saw discomfort. They saw the ordinary hardships of soldiering. They saw men complaining of fever, weakness, stomach trouble, and exhaustion. But in the South, these symptoms could be blamed on malaria, and some doctors still used the older Civil War-era label typhomalaria when they could not distinguish one disease from another. The more precise diagnosis of typhoid required laboratory methods and experience that were not yet available everywhere in the camps. So while the true danger gathered strength, it was partly hidden by uncertainty. The army was not merely short of tents and wagons, it was short of clarity. There is a particular sentence in the army's later medical history that captures the mood of these camps with unsettling accuracy. Officers, both military and medical, often assumed that the unpleasant conditions they saw were simply what soldiers were expected to endure. They believed that good troops should tolerate hardship without complaint, even with a certain pride. That attitude sounds tough. It sounds almost admirable until you realize what it meant in practice. Men slept too close together, tents were crowded, latrines were too near living areas, camps were laid out on badly drained ground. Some soldiers avoided the established sinks altogether and relieved themselves in nearby wooded areas. The issue was not that every person was careless or uncaring. The issue was that large numbers of inexperienced men, placed in poor conditions, were given too little sanitation discipline and too little reason to treat hygiene as life or death. Camp George H. Thomas at Chickamauga, Georgia, became the most notorious example. It was enormous. The 1st and 3rd Corps gathered there in the spring of 1898, each corps averaging around 40,000 men, creating what one army history called an enormous army of inexperienced and undisciplined soldiers, accompanied by equally inexperienced doctors. Some recruits were not fully fit for service when they entered the army. Both corps were already carrying typhoid into the camp. Yet the camp's senior medical officer, Lieutenant Colonel Albert Hartsuff, had only limited authority over line officers when it came to enforcing sanitation. He and his surgeons could observe and recommend, they could warn, they could document, but they could not simply command every regiment to behave differently. That limitation mattered more than it may sound. Disease prevention in a camp is not achieved by medical advice alone. It depends on command obedience. A surgeon can say the latrines need better placement. A commander has to make sure it happens. A surgeon can urge that men boil their water. Officers have to enforce it, and men have to comply even when the process is inconvenient. A surgeon can warn that flies moving between waste and food are dangerous. Someone must then keep kitchens clean, cover refuse, and police the grounds. In 1898, the chain between medical knowledge and daily discipline was too weak in too many places. The warning existed, the enforcement often did not. Camp Thomas began to show what that weakness cost. The woods around the camp became fouled with excrement. Army records later described the surrounding soil as so contaminated that walking through it without stepping into filth became difficult. Flies moved in huge numbers from the sinks and surrounding waste toward kitchens and food supplies. The ground itself worked against the camp. Heavy clay soil rested over rock and held water instead of draining it. When rains came at the end of June and continued for roughly 2 weeks, latrines overflowed and water sources became increasingly suspect. By the end of July, one medical officer believed the water supply had become polluted. Orders were issued to boil water, filtered or unfiltered, because the existing filters were too slow, fragile and impractical for use on a large scale. In the one regiment that followed the boiling order strictly, typhoid was still absent as late as August 7th. That detail is small, but it tells us a great deal. Disease was not an unstoppable fog rolling over the entire camp in exactly the same way. Behaviour mattered. Sanitation mattered. Compliance mattered. One regiment could remain free of typhoid longer because it obeyed a tedious preventive order that others did not. This is why the disaster is so painful to study. The problem was not that every death came from a mystery beyond human control. Some of the danger was understood, at least in fragments, while the epidemic was unfolding. But partial understanding without organised discipline is often not enough. By early August, nearly 3,000 officers and men at Camp Thomas were sick, not counting those already sent away to general hospitals. The overall sick rate continued to climb, and the disease appeared to grow more severe as exposure increased. Many early cases were mild enough that infected men continued mingling with healthy comrades, unknowingly helping the disease travel. Crowded hospitals then created another danger. Convalescents were often sent back to their units before their role in continued transmission was understood. Medical officers of the time did not yet fully appreciate that some recovering patients could remain carriers for long periods. So the camp tried to relieve one problem, overcrowded treatment facilities, and accidentally worsened another. There is a human rhythm to a camp epidemic that is difficult to capture in statistics. The day begins and someone is missing from drill. Another man appears pale at breakfast and cannot finish his ration. One tent has 2 men lying down when they should be standing in formation. A surgeon writes notes, then more notes. The hospital receives patients faster than it releases them. Friends volunteer to carry a sick comrade. Men begin to speak more quietly when illness is mentioned. Rumours circulate. This regiment is badly hit. That hospital is full. A wagon was seen carrying more men out. Nothing dramatic happens all at once, and yet the whole camp slowly changes its character. It stops feeling like a temporary home for men preparing for glory, and starts feeling like a place where bodies are failing in sequence. The later records show the totals, but the lived experience was built from hundreds of small daily recognitions. At Camp Thomas, the hospital system buckled under the pressure. Surgeons called desperately for more tents. Some patients briefly had to lie on the ground because there was not enough space. In one division, between 1,225 men out of roughly 11 to 12,000 were sick, and some had to remain in their own quarters temporarily because hospital space was lacking. There were not enough doctors, there were not enough attendants. Order and discipline inside some medical facilities deteriorated. Typhoid patients sometimes lost control of their bowels, soiling bedding and floors, creating further sanitation challenges in places already strained beyond capacity. Treatment was largely symptomatic. Physicians used cold baths or sponging to reduce fever, purgatives to relieve constipation, alcohol and strychnine in efforts to affect the pulse, and sedatives for sleeplessness. They worked with the tools they had, but those tools could not reverse the conditions that kept producing new patients. The hospitals multiplied because they had to. General facilities were established and expanded. Lita General Hospital, set up in a converted hotel near Chickamauga Park, was already badly overcrowded by August, with 255 beds in space, intended for no more than 130. A second general hospital, later named Sternberg Hospital, opened at Camp Thomas with a capacity of 750 beds. Division and regimental hospitals, originally expected to serve more limited purposes, were forced to remain active and grow because the number of sick men made ideal organisation impossible. More than 40% of the over 4,000 Camp Thomas men hospitalised with typhoid remained in regimental facilities, and 79 of the 263 typhoid deaths at Chickamauga occurred there. When we think about military readiness, We often imagine weapons, ammunition, cavalry, ships, and transport. The Spanish-American War reminds us that beds matter too, laundry matters, clean sheets matter, trained nurses matter, clerks who can manage admissions matter, diet kitchens matter because the sick cannot always eat the same ration as healthy soldiers. At Camp Thomas and elsewhere, civilian charitable organisations and the Red Cross provided help when the army systems fell short. The epidemic forced rapid changes, including greater reliance on trained female nurses in army hospitals. By September 15, 1898, more than 1,000 women held contracts to care for army patients, often working 12-hour days for modest monthly pay. Their presence became indispensable, precisely because the war's medical burden had exceeded what many planners had expected. Camp Thomas was not alone. Camp Alger in Virginia, established in mid-May 1898 only 7 miles from Washington, D.C., suffered its own severe crisis. It was smaller than Camp Thomas, but still enormous by ordinary standards, with troop levels ranging from around 18,000 men in May to more than 23,000 in June. Its chief surgeon, Lieutenant Colonel Alfred C. Girard, later described the task before him as Herculean. He had to teach raw troops how to obtain food, water, fuel and clothing, while also instructing them in basic hygiene, organising division hospitals, equipping medical departments for campaign, assembling a hospital corps, and trying to impose order on a camp that kept changing as units arrived and departed. The water shortage at Camp Alger made everything worse, so did sanitation. Girard reported that many regimental surgeons were careless about camp hygiene, and that colonels often ignored medical recommendations. A suggestion that each soldier cover his faeces was largely disregarded until early August, when an order finally enforced it. Many soldiers ignored latrines entirely. The woods around the camp became a general receptacle for human waste, and sentinels assigned to prevent the practice failed to report their own comrades. That sentence carries a whole culture inside it. Men did not want to betray friends over something that seemed minor. Officers did not yet treat these violations with the seriousness they deserved. The cost of that informal leniency was paid later in fever wards. Camp Alger also suffered from supply confusion. Many regiments arrived without hospital tents or medicines, despite earlier warnings from Surgeon General George M. Sternberg that the federal department could not quickly provide everything volunteer units failed to bring. Girard had to create division hospital capacity immediately and compel units to contribute supplies. Meanwhile, because he mistakenly believed the whole Second Corps might be sent overseas at once, he initially focused on preparing for field operations rather than fully adapting the hospital system to the needs of a long-term training camp. In the haste of war, the camp was being organised for tomorrow while today's dangers expanded in plain sight. After an inspection in early July, one senior medical official concluded that the disease rate at Camp Alger remained low. Then typhoid broke out sharply soon afterward. Girard later said cases became so numerous that he was never sure of the exact count. Some men who felt ill went on leave before diagnosis. Others were moved to nearby Fort Myer Hospital before an accurate evaluation could be made. As at Camp Thomas, there was diagnostic confusion. Some physicians insisted malaria was the real culprit. Others used the older hybrid label typhomalaria. Girard maintained that typhoid was the principal problem, and later studies supported his position. The transportation of the sick from Camp Alger tells its own story. At first, patients were moved by ambulance to Fort Myer, only about 10 miles away. Eventually the toll became so heavy that the medical department placed 2 hospital cars on the local trolley line to carry the ill. That image is worth holding on to. A trolley, ordinarily part of daily urban life, converted into a vehicle for fever patients because the camp could not absorb them fast enough. After 200 men had been sent to Fort Myer, Girard was ordered to stop sending more for a week because the receiving hospital was overwhelmed. The camp had created illness faster than the surrounding medical network could process it. The Red Cross eventually established a hospital at Camp Alger and a diet kitchen at Fort Myer. Trained female nurses were also brought in, and Girard praised their care as superior to what untrained male attendants could provide. This is another part of the war that tends to disappear beneath the larger martial narrative. Armies often reveal their shortages by the kinds of help they suddenly must seek from outside themselves. The volunteer enthusiasm of 1898 had filled the ranks quickly, but the support system around those ranks was still being improvised. Disease forced the country to improvise faster. Eventually, commanders began trying to flee the disease by moving troops elsewhere. In mid-July, parts of the Second Corps left Camp Alger after officials concluded that the site, equipment and camp environment had become thoroughly infected. Men received sudden orders to march, even with food supplies inadequate. Those who fell ill along the way were sent back to field hospitals. Later, healthy elements were transferred to Camp Meade in Pennsylvania, where planners attempted to apply lessons learned from Alger. Tents had been boiled. Blankets used by typhoid patients were steam disinfected. Sanitary rules were enforced more strictly. A contract surgeon was assigned regular latrine inspection duties. The fact that these measures were put in place tells us plainly what the army had already concluded. The old camp habits had been dangerous, and yet even with improvement, the damage did not vanish overnight. Men infected earlier could still fall ill after transfer. Camp Meade received troops from Alger who were already carrying the consequences of the previous camp's failures. The disease did not respect relocation orders. It travelled in human bodies. It travelled with units that believed they had escaped one environment only to discover that the epidemic had already come with them. This is why the title of this part matters. Before many American soldiers ever faced Spanish fire, the camps were already sick. Not metaphorically sick. Not simply uncomfortable or badly managed. Sick in a measurable, deadly sense. Typhoid had entered the army's temporary cities and begun altering the course of the war from within. The disease rates climbed high enough that Surgeon General Sternberg eventually appointed a special board of medical officers to investigate the epidemic and recommend changes, so that the horrors of that summer would not be repeated. That board would become one of the most important medical inquiries of the era. But by the time it began its work in August, thousands had already been infected. There is a temptation to imagine that these camps were unfortunate side stories, separate from the war itself. They were not. They were part of the war. Mobilization is war, training is war, supply is war, sanitation is war. Every mistake made in camp shaped what units could later do, how many men remained fit, how hospitals would function overseas, and how the public would come to understand the price of the conflict. A regiment weakened by fever carries that weakness forward. A medical department stretched thin before deployment enters later crises already exhausted. A country that sees soldiers dying in domestic camps has to confront the possibility that bravery and patriotism are not enough to protect men from institutions that fail to prepare properly. And still, the camps kept moving through their routines. Reveille sounded. Officers inspected lines. Men drilled when they were well enough. Letters went home with cheerful sentences that may have softened reality for worried parents. Newspapers printed updates, not always accurate, sometimes sensational, sometimes defensive. Sick men watched other men remain healthy and wondered why. Healthy men watched sick men disappear and tried not to think too much about it. The war had promised movement toward an enemy across the sea, but the first great struggle for many of them was against the water they drank, the ground beneath their tents, the flies that hovered near supper, and the systems that failed to take those things seriously soon enough. By the time American troops prepared to leave for Cuba in large numbers, disease had already demonstrated its power. It had shown that an army could injure itself through neglect long before an opposing force had the chance. It had shown that the smallest details of camp life could become lethal under pressure. It had shown that a hurried nation can gather men faster than it can protect them, and it had left the soldiers who remained standing with a lesson they had not expected to learn so early. The most dangerous part of a war may begin in the place that was supposed to make you ready for it. By the time the army began pushing men south toward Tampa, The disease problem had already moved beyond the training grounds. It was no longer contained within one camp, or one regiment, or one badly drained field where tents stood too close to latrines. It was travelling with the soldiers themselves, men who had spent days or weeks in camps where typhoid was already circulating, now boarded trains, carrying their uniforms, their rifles, their nervous excitement, and in some cases infections that had not yet fully declared themselves. A soldier could look healthy at the rail station, laugh with his company, complain about the heat, climb into a crowded car, and still be days away from collapsing with fever. That is what made the transition from camp to transport so dangerous. The army believed it was moving fighting strength toward Cuba. In part it was, but it was also moving disease along the same route, from regimental camps to rail depots, from rail depots to Tampa, from Tampa to the ships waiting in the harbour, and from those ships toward the Caribbean. Medical officers later understood that typhoid already existed among troops in Tampa before embarkation, and that a number of cases developed during voyages to Cuba after men had boarded transports from units previously exposed in infected camps. Tampa was chosen because it offered a route to Cuba that appeared practical on a map. It sat on Florida's Gulf Coast, close enough to the island to serve as the staging ground for an expedition against Santiago. In reality, the port was not prepared for what arrived in the spring of 1898. More than 30,000 troops passed through the Tampa area during the war, and the Army and Navy had to use the city as a vast improvised funnel for men, animals, ammunition, food, wagons, artillery, medical supplies, and everything else an expeditionary force required. The problem was not simply that there was a great deal to move. The problem was that the system moving it had not been built for this purpose. A single-track railroad linked Tampa to the port area. The harbour itself had limited access. Supplies poured in faster than they could be sorted. Troops arrived before adequate space. Water or sanitation had been arranged for them. Even before the ships sailed, the expedition was becoming disordered by the pressure of its own urgency. This confusion matters because disease thrives in moments when ordinary routines break down. A regiment in a well-run post may still suffer illness, but its food, water and waste can at least be managed by predictable procedures. Tampa did not feel predictable. Units waited in camps around the city with little certainty about when they would move. Equipment arrived late or incomplete. Some volunteers lacked proper tropical clothing and endured Florida heat in heavy garments, more suitable for cooler weather. Water supplies were strained. Sanitary arrangements were poor enough that the Army Transportation Corps later described the lack of water and sanitary facilities as one reason units had to encamp in scattered places around Tampa, rather than in a carefully organised staging area. Men drilled when they could, loafed when they had nothing to do, wandered into town, wrote home, complained about delays, and waited under a sun that gave every discomfort sharper edges. The war was supposed to be across the water. Instead, the first major struggle for many units was simply enduring the disorder of mobilization. The ships waiting for them did not promise relief. When the United States declared war, the Army did not possess an established fleet of transport vessels ready to carry large expeditionary forces overseas. It had to acquire ships quickly, purchasing or chartering civilian vessels and converting them for military use. By the end of May, the government had gathered dozens of transports, but many had not been designed to move large numbers of soldiers. Some were former freighters. Some were adapted from vessels built for other uses entirely. Workers installed bunks, water tanks, and ventilation systems as rapidly as possible, but even after conversion, conditions remained crude. One transport designed for a complement of roughly 1,200 men reportedly had only 12 toilets. The estimated carrying capacity of the transport fleet had to be revised downward because there was less usable space than planners first believed. A soldier from the 6th Infantry later remarked that it was a misnomer to call some of these vessels transports at all. That complaint was not merely about comfort, It was about the difference between a ship that can move cargo and a ship that can safely carry hundreds or thousands of human beings already weakened by camp life. The loading process made things worse. Orders came to embark as rapidly as possible, and the port struggled to respond. Supplies had to move along the same congested rail line as troops. Ships rotated in and out of narrow berthing space. Stevedores worked long hours hauling material by hand from rail cars over sandy ground and up steep ramps. Artillery components had arrived in separate shipments and had to be found, assembled, and loaded under pressure. Rations needed to be redistributed across different vessels in case ships became separated during the crossing. Medical supplies competed for space with weapons, ammunition, food, horses, wagons, and tents. The aim was to preserve unit organisation and load men with their equipment, but the result was often confused and uneven. This is where the later medical crisis in Cuba began to take shape. When medical officers needed tents, wagons, medicines, and hospital gear after landing, some of those supplies were still buried deep in ships' holds, inaccessible when urgently required. Surgeon General George M. Sternberg later criticised the decision to push the expedition forward from Tampa before medical stores had been properly disembarked and organised for use. For the soldiers, boarding did not always lead immediately to departure. One army study later summarised the situation plainly. Shafter ordered a rush to the transports, only for men to wait for 3 days aboard hot, cramped vessels before sailing. That detail deserves more attention than it usually receives. A soldier who had already spent weeks in Florida heat now found himself packed into a ship where air circulation was poor, personal space was scarce, and sanitary arrangements were inadequate. Men slept in shifts where bunks were insufficient. They sweated in close quarters. They descended into lower decks where the air was worse and the smell of bodies, damp clothing, food, coal smoke and shipboard waste gathered heavily. The ship did not create typhoid by itself, but it gave disease excellent conditions to continue its progress. Men who were already incubating illness had now been placed in a setting where weakened health, overcrowding and limited sanitation made everything more difficult. It is easy to imagine the emotional contrast. Only days earlier, these same men may have marched through Tampa streets with crowds watching and bands playing, or stood near the railway sidings with their gear piled beside them, convinced that the long wait was finally ending. Photographs and drawings from the period show troops in Port Tampa preparing for transport, their bodies arranged in lines and groups that suggest order. But a still image cannot show heat. It cannot show the impatience of men who have been told to embark and then remain aboard. It cannot show one soldier waking with a headache and another complaining of stomach trouble. It cannot show the surgeon quietly taking note of men who no longer seem merely tired. Disease begins its advance in these small changes, not with a bell, not with a public announcement, with a few men who are not quite well, in a place that makes recovery harder. Some cases were already serious enough to appear before arrival in Cuba. Official medical reports recorded that a number of typhoid cases developed during voyages to the island. Colonel William H. Greenleaf described one July voyage aboard the USS Yale, which carried troops that had previously been at Camp Alger, one of the infected training camps. During the journey, several cases of typhoid emerged and had to be treated under shipboard conditions. This is a crucial link in the story. Disease did not leap magically from one setting to another. It followed the actual movements of men. Camp Alger had been sick. Men from Camp Alger boarded ships. Some developed typhoid en route. By the time transports reached the Caribbean, the army was not simply bringing soldiers into a new disease environment. It was bringing infected troops from home into an already difficult campaign. The voyage to Cuba was not exceptionally long, but time does not need to be long when a body is already failing. Typhoid fever often unfolds gradually. Early symptoms can be vague. A man may feel weakness, headache, chills, loss of appetite, or abdominal discomfort before anyone recognises that he has a major infection. On a crowded transport, symptoms like these could be attributed to seasickness, heat, poor food, or simple exhaustion. Soldiers had reasons to minimize what they felt. No one wanted to be marked sick just as the expedition finally moved toward battle. No one wanted to be left behind or transferred away from his company. The desire to remain useful often delayed recognition of illness, and delay in a confined environment has consequences. By the time a man clearly required care, he may already have spent days among his comrades while the disease progressed. The ship compressed the social world of a regiment. Men ate, slept, waited, and suffered within yards of one another. The Army's medical organisation had to work under these shipboard limitations. Each transport could not function like a proper hospital. Some had medical officers aboard. Some did not have enough. Supplies were uneven. Space for the sick was limited. Care at sea was shaped by whatever had been loaded, whatever could be reached, and whatever the ship's arrangements allowed. The same transport system that moved the healthy toward war would later be criticised for the difficulty of moving the sick away from it. Medical histories from the campaign noted that transports were not designed or staffed to handle patients who boarded in poor condition or became ill while underway. That concern became especially visible during evacuations from Cuba, but the underlying problem existed from the beginning. A vessel designed hastily to carry soldiers could quickly become a place where medical needs outran every arrangement made for them. While the men waited or sailed, officers and surgeons were still thinking ahead to combat. They worried about landing beaches, Spanish defences, roads, baggage animals, artillery movement, and the possibility of heavy casualties. Those concerns were valid. The landing at Decurie would soon reveal how difficult simply getting men and supplies ashore could be. Surf conditions, insufficient small boats, and poor unloading arrangements created enormous problems. Medical supplies were among the items slowest to reach the shore in usable form. As many as 200 badly needed hospital tents remained at the bottom of a ship's hold and could not be reached for days. Medical baggage wagons and mules had been left behind amid the confusion at Tampa. The problems of transport did not end when the ships left Florida. They followed the force to Cuba and immediately complicated the care of both wounded and sick men. There is a pattern here worth noticing. At each stage, the Army was not dealing with one separate failure, but with a chain of connected weaknesses. Camps were overcrowded and unsanitary. Sick men entered the movement system. Tampa strained under too many troops and too little organisation. Ships were acquired late and adapted quickly. Loading was rushed. Medical supplies were badly positioned. Men waited aboard cramped vessels before sailing. Some developed typhoid during the voyage. Then, after landing, the supplies needed to manage disease and injury were still difficult to access. Disease advanced because the system kept creating openings for it. It advanced through delay, crowding, poor sequencing, and the mistaken assumption that health could be dealt with after the more urgent business of movement had been completed. The language of military planning often gives movement a clean appearance. Embarkation, deployment, transport, disembarkation. Each term sounds efficient when written in a report. In 1898, the lived experience was rougher. Men sat in stalled rail cars. Gear arrived without proper coordination. Officers searched for supplies that should have been easy to find. Ships took aboard more discomfort than confidence. The Army was learning under pressure that overseas warfare required more than courage and ships. It required a disciplined process for moving human beings without damaging them before they reached the field. The Transportation Corps later treated Tampa as an important lesson in deployment failure, noting that the expedition did not arrive in Cuba at an optimal state of readiness. That is an understated way of saying that the route to battle had already diminished the force. For the soldiers themselves, however, such lessons were not abstractions. They were personal. One man was assigned a berth in airless quarters and slept badly. Another stood in line for water and drank quickly because his mouth was dry. Another tried to ignore a fever because he wanted to go ashore with his company. another saw a comrade lying apart from the others and realised that sickness had followed them out of camp. The sea crossing created a false sense of transition. It seemed that the army had left one stage of the war behind and was entering another. In truth, the old danger had boarded with them. The camps had been sick. Now the transports were carrying that sickness forward. By the time the expedition approached Cuba, the war was narrowing toward action. The soldiers would soon come ashore at Daiquiri and Siboney. They would march inland through heat and rough country. Some would fight at Las Guasimas, El Caney, and San Juan Hill. The headlines would soon focus on battlefield courage, and rightly so. But beneath those coming events, another story was already underway. Men had left American camps carrying the damage of American sanitation failures. Some fell ill before touching Cuban soil. Others would weaken after landing, their bodies pushed further by heat, exposure, and exhaustion. The troopships did not mark a clean departure from the disease crisis of the camps. They marked its expansion. The sickness that had begun in the training grounds was now moving with the army into the campaign itself, quietly keeping pace as the invasion force sailed south. The first American troops began landing on Cuban soil on June 22nd, 1898, at Daiquiri, a small coastal settlement east of Santiago. It was not the sort of place most officers would have chosen if they had been planning calmly, with plenty of time and accurate maps spread across a broad table. Earlier ideas for the invasion had imagined operations closer to Havana, where flatter ground and better roads might have allowed supplies, artillery and ambulances to move more easily. Instead, the campaign turned toward eastern Cuba, toward steep beaches, rough country, narrow tracks, and a landscape that seemed determined to punish movement. The soldiers came ashore in waves, roughly 6,000 on the first day, and many thousands more over the next two. The landings themselves were not seriously opposed by Spanish forces, but the surf was rough enough that the chief surgeon of the Fifth Corps later considered it remarkable that only 2 men drowned. Even before the army marched inland, Cuba had begun to show that it would not be a passive setting for the war. It would shape everything that happened there. The men who stepped from boats onto that beach had already endured the delays and discomforts of Tampa and the troopships. Many were tired before they ever touched the island. Some were underfed. Some had spent nights aboard transports where heat and poor ventilation left them restless and irritable. Some belonged to units that had passed through camps where disease was already circulating. They came ashore carrying rifles, haversacks, canteens, blankets, and expectations built from newspaper stories and recruiting speeches. What awaited them looked nothing like the clear geometry of a map. The shoreline was crowded and confused. The ships sat offshore. Supplies had to be brought in by small boats that were too few in number. Weapons and ammunition understandably received priority, but the consequence was that medical supplies, hospital equipment and tents remained trapped aboard the transports. As many as 200 badly needed hospital tents were buried at the bottom of one ship's hold and could not be reached for days. The army had landed troops, but it had not landed everything required to keep those troops healthy. This is one of the central truths of the Cuban campaign. The army did not simply enter a difficult environment, it entered that environment already disorganized. Medical baggage wagons and mules had been left behind in the confusion at Tampa. When physicians needed to move supplies inland, they had to improvise transportation over roads that were hardly roads at all, more like rocky trails pressing through uneven country. The landscape made every delay heavier. A crate that might have been moved quickly on a good road became a problem requiring men, animals, luck, and time. A hospital that should have been ready near the front had to wait. Tents that should have sheltered the injured and sick sat unopened in the wrong place. When people imagine battlefield suffering, they often imagine the moment of injury. Yet suffering also begins when a wounded man reaches a place where no bed has arrived, no tent is ready, and the medicines that could make his care easier are still offshore. The first clash with Spanish troops came 2 days later at Las Guasimas. American forces pushed inland and defeated Spanish troops withdrawing towards Santiago, but they suffered dozens of wounded in the process. The Army's surgeons credited the new first aid packets distributed to soldiers with helping reduce infection from wounds, because men could apply sterile dressings before reaching a physician. It was a small but important sign that modern military medicine was beginning to take shape. Yet even here, one sees how fragile good preparation could be. Many soldiers later discarded those packets as they marched through tropical country, lightening their loads without fully understanding how valuable those little bundles might become. That is the story of this campaign again and again. Something useful existed. Something sensible had been planned. Then heat, exhaustion, confusion, or poor judgment stripped away the protection. At first, the overall health of the force still appeared reasonably good. Fewer than 150 men were reported sick during the lull after Las Guasimas. That brief stability mattered because it created an illusion. It made it possible to believe that the army had crossed the ocean, fought its first engagement, and remained more or less intact. The transports were gradually unloaded. Medicines reached Siboney from Tampa. A field hospital was brought ashore. The Red Cross arrived and prepared to assist. For a short time there was reason to think the force was adjusting, but the adjustment was incomplete and temporary. One hospital had to function without beds or bedding because equipment moved too slowly. Another site became wet when adequate shelter was unavailable. Even in the moments that looked like improvement, the signs of vulnerability remained. The army was trying to build a medical system in motion, with Spanish forces ahead, supply problems behind, and tropical weather all around. Then the climate began to wear on the troops more openly. Cuba in late June and July was not merely warm. Soldiers described punishing sunlight, exhausting humidity, and nights that brought little true relief. Later accounts noted that temperatures could soar to extraordinary levels in the shade during the day, then fall sharply after sunset. Rain came frequently, sometimes every night and nearly every day. The Fifth Corps lacked sufficient shelter and suitable clothing, and this constant cycle of blazing heat followed by soaking rain began to grind men down. One moment a soldier's uniform clung to him with sweat beneath a fierce sun. Hours later the same fabric might be wet from tropical rain as he tried to sleep on damp ground. The body struggles under that kind of repeated stress. Fatigue deepens, appetite fades, minor illnesses become harder to shake. A man who might resist infection under better conditions becomes more vulnerable when he is hungry, overheated, underslept, and wet. Theodore Roosevelt, who was not inclined to present himself as delicate, wrote on July 12th that only about 350 of his roughly 600 Rough Riders were fit for duty. He described the men as suffering from sun, rain, poor drinking water, and lack of plain food. His own boast that he remained strong does not soften the larger point. Nearly half his command had already been reduced by wounds, fever, dysentery, and heat, only days after the major fighting began. That condition was not unique to the Rough Riders. It reflected a broader collapse in the health of the Corps. The army had crossed the sea expecting the enemy to weaken it. Cuba had begun doing so through exposure, exhaustion, and disease, often faster than the Spanish army could. Water became one of the most dangerous necessities. Men marched under punishing heat and drained their canteens quickly. Boiled water was the safer choice, but carrying enough of it was difficult, and producing large quantities in the field was not simple. The arrival of cauldrons needed for boiling water was delayed, and fuel for fires was short. Drinking sources could be polluted by soldiers, animals, and laundry washed in streams. One surgeon later confessed that after finishing the boiled water in his canteen, he became so thirsty that he drank from a puddle, even though he knew it might be infected. That is the kind of detail that reveals how disease spreads in real life. It is rarely because people casually invite danger. It spreads because the body eventually overrides caution. A thirsty man in the tropics does not always choose between clean water and dirty water. Sometimes he chooses between dirty water and no water at all. The medical officers faced a cruel mixture of older knowledge and newer uncertainty. They knew contaminated water mattered. They knew camp cleanliness mattered. They understood that diarrheal disease and typhoid could follow unsanitary conditions. But malaria was still imperfectly understood by many physicians in the army, even though its transmission by mosquitoes had only just been established in the scientific world. Some still believed the parasite spread through drinking water. So when malaria rates climbed even after orders to boil water, doctors sometimes concluded that soldiers must not have obeyed instructions. The truth was more complicated. Boiling water could help prevent some infections, but it would not keep mosquitoes from feeding on men who slept unscreened, exhausted, and exposed. The campaign was unfolding during a moment when medical science had made great advances, yet those advances had not been fully absorbed into field practice. Typhoid, malaria, diarrhea, dysentery, and other fevers began pressing on the Corps from different directions. Some men had likely brought typhoid exposure from earlier camps in the United States. Others encountered new dangers in Cuba through contaminated water and poor field sanitation. Malaria added another layer of misery, bringing chills, fever, weakness, and recurring debility. Physicians also recorded what they called ephemeral fever, an illness that did not respond to quinine, and may have represented typhoid, dengue, or other febrile conditions that were difficult to distinguish under the circumstances. The soldiers did not need a perfect diagnosis to know they were suffering. They knew their legs weakened. They knew appetite disappeared. They knew men who had marched sturdily a week earlier now lay in the shade unable to stand. The invisible battlefield was not one disease alone. It was the combined pressure of multiple illnesses attacking men whose resistance had been steadily lowered by the campaign itself. The roads towards Santiago deepened the problem. Supplies did not glide forward in orderly columns. They scraped, stumbled, and bogged down. Medical officers had to move what they could across trails never intended for the sudden demands of an American expedition. When wounded men had to be brought back from El Caney and San Juan Hill, transport was painfully inadequate. General Shafter argued that supply wagons could serve as reasonably comfortable substitutes for ambulances on muddy roads. Surgeons who watched sick and wounded men packed into those wagons saw matters differently. They saw men jolted over bad ground, crowded together because there was no better option, hurried away from the field because leaving them by the roadside was worse. The condition of the roads was not a minor inconvenience. It became part of the suffering of the wounded and a direct obstacle to care. This is where the word mud begins to carry more weight. Rain in a tropical campaign is not merely rain. It changes the ground. It turns paths slick. It fills hollows. It swells streams. It spreads waste. It makes movement slower precisely when speed is needed most. Army medical history later described the higher ground proposed for relocation as terrain, where heavy rains created quagmires and where malaria flourished. That problem came to matter when officers considered moving troops away from lower, supposedly unhealthy areas near Santiago. The solution sounded sensible in theory. Move men to higher ground. Get them out of the dangerous zone. Let them recover. But the roads were poor, the men were weak, and the wet uplands offered their own misery. Every attempted adjustment had a cost. Changing camps could make sick men sicker. Remaining where they were could do the same. The battles of El Caney and San Juan Hill on July 1st brought the campaign's combat suffering to a peak. By the time those guns fell silent, almost 4/5 of all American wounded in the Cuban phase of the war had already been injured. The base hospital at Siboney suddenly had to absorb more than 1,000 wounded. Doctors had prepared for around 200. Tents could not be raised quickly enough to shelter everyone. Some of the injured arrived without proper clothing, exposed and exhausted after the chaos of battle and evacuation. Medical teams worked with almost no rest for days. Surgical tables operated in rotation as physicians became too tired to continue. The Red Cross supplied beds, bedding and food items that army hospitals lacked. The battle had lasted hours. The medical consequences stretched onward through nights of labour. And still the invisible battlefield widened. Once the large battles subsided, fever took over more of the army's attention. The surrender of Santiago would not come until July 17th, but by the second week of the month, disease was already alarming officers more than the possibility of further combat. Shafter reported that fever cases were increasing rapidly. On July 22nd, he recorded 214 new cases of various fevers in a single day. On July 23rd, he estimated roughly 1,500 fever victims across the Fifth Corps, with about a tenth of them believed to have yellow fever. The exact diagnoses were uncertain, but the scale of illness was not. The men were falling sick in numbers impossible to dismiss. Yellow fever held a special terror because it was both feared and poorly understood. Malaria and typhoid were dreadful, but yellow fever carried a reputation that bordered on myth in the 19th century imagination. It had devastated cities. It appeared suddenly. It could kill swiftly. Physicians in Cuba had difficulty distinguishing it from malaria and typhoid without adequate laboratory support, and the role of the mosquito in spreading it was not yet firmly established in practice among army doctors. As a result, yellow fever seemed to lurk everywhere. Buildings were suspected, shady recesses were suspected, places that had sheltered civilians were suspected. Once the first case was diagnosed at Siboney on July 6th, anxiety intensified quickly. Fear itself became a force shaping medical decisions. The town of Siboney became a focal point of that fear. American officers believed infection clung to the settlement, and that destroying the buildings might help halt the spread. Beginning July 11th, buildings in Siboney were burned as they became vacant, a drastic act carried out in the belief that the source of yellow fever could be sterilised by fire. Major Louis Lagarde supported the measure even though he considered typhoid a greater danger in practical terms. The burning did not stop the rise of disease. Fever cases continued. Yellow fever cases, real or suspected, multiplied. The army was using the best reasoning available to it in a frightening moment, but that reasoning was still pointed in the wrong direction. Fire could destroy buildings. It could not eliminate the mosquito problem the physicians had not yet fully grasped. By July 19th, Colonel Benjamin Pope reported that half of the sick men in the Fifth Corps lacked shelter and that 1,000 additional beds were needed. At Siboney, Major Lagarde's facilities overflowed. 3 of his surgeons were ill. The Corps had left him without vehicles to move supplies. Plans for a floating yellow fever hospital appear to have been abandoned. On July 20th, convinced that exposure had already become widespread, Lagarde opened the entire tent hospital at Siboney to yellow fever patients, separating them only by ward rather than attempting strict isolation. This was not calm, confident medical control. It was the work of exhausted officers trying to make impossible choices under conditions of crowding, fear, and inadequate resources. There were moments of improvement. After Santiago surrendered on July 17th, more buildings and better organised hospital arrangements became possible. Regimental tents had finally been unloaded from the transports. New hospitals were opened in and around the city. Division hospitals were created, a general field hospital was organised, and equipment such as sterilisers, water heaters, bathtubs, and operating tables began to appear. One senior medical officer later described the resulting tent hospital as among the best in the world. That may have reflected pride as much as reality, but it also shows that the army could build better systems once it had time, access, and less immediate battlefield pressure. The tragedy was that many men had already suffered through the period when none of those things were available in sufficient measure. The shortage of personnel remained severe. Hospital corpsmen were always too few. Volunteers pressed into guard duty sometimes had to perform nursing tasks for which they had little preparation. Fear of yellow fever made assignments even more difficult. Colonel Charles Greenleaf urgently requested hundreds of hospital attendants Immune nurses and doctors believed less likely to succumb to the disease. When Shafter hesitated to strip men from the front for hospital work, Greenleaf appealed upward, and the 24th Infantry, a black regular regiment, was ordered to Siboney to assist with guard duty, policing and nursing chores. Lagarde later wrote that because of their discipline, order finally began to emerge from chaos. Their work is one of those essential wartime contributions that easily disappears when history narrows itself to charges and victories alone. Female nurses also proved indispensable, despite earlier doubts about employing them near campaign conditions. Immune or supposedly immune nurses from the United States, many of them women, were praised as invaluable in Cuba. Major Francis Ives, who had initially opposed the use of women nurses in the theatre, later concluded that they were superior to male attendants in the division and general hospitals. That shift in opinion did not happen because of abstract debate. It happened because the hospitals needed skill, discipline and endurance, and the women who came supplied all three. The campaign's disease crisis forced the army to accept capabilities it had been reluctant to use fully at the outset. Meanwhile, the ordinary soldier continued to live in conditions that made illness hard to avoid. Shelter remained uneven. Food was sometimes poor. Water was difficult to purify. The heat continued. The rain continued. Men who had been exposed to infection now had fewer physical reserves to resist it. Even after the major fighting ended, the disease rates kept rising. That sequence matters. Combat did not produce one burst of suffering followed by recovery. Combat added injuries to an army already being worn down by the environment, and then disease carried on when the rifles quieted. The official surrender of Santiago did not bring immediate relief to the bodies of the men who had taken part in the campaign. Many of them were only beginning to understand how sick they had become. When people later remembered Cuba, they remembered the famous hills, the mounted figures, the smoke of battle, the victory over Spain. Those things belonged to the campaign. But so did the puddle a surgeon drank from because thirst overpowered caution. So did the hospital bedding gone wet because shelter had not arrived. So did the roads that shook the wounded in supply wagons. So did the fever wards at Siboney. So did the burned town, destroyed in fear of a disease physicians did not yet know how to stop. So did the exhausted doctors, the black regulars performing nursing duty, and the women nurses whose value became undeniable under pressure. The Cuban campaign was not merely a contest between two armies. It was a struggle between the American expedition and the conditions that surrounded it. Conditions made worse by its own logistical failures and made deadly by pathogens that no soldier could see. The army had crossed the sea to fight a war, and in Cuba it found that the visible enemy was only part of what awaited it. Spanish troops could be located on a ridge or behind defences. Disease moved through camps, water, insects, exhaustion and fear. Heat weakened men before fever took hold. Rain soaked bedding before chills began. Mud slowed wagons before hospitals could receive the wounded. Every inconvenience fed the next danger. By the middle of July, the campaign had revealed a truth that would shape everything that followed. The most relentless opponent in Cuba did not always fire from a trench. It worked through the body quietly, continuously, and with no need for victory celebrations to announce its advance. The illness that did the greatest damage to the American army in 1898 did not arrive with a sudden crash. It did not announce itself the way a shell did, or the way rifle fire snapped through brush on a hillside. Typhoid fever moved more slowly than that. It entered through routines that seemed ordinary. A hand not washed after tending a sick man. Food left exposed where flies gathered. A stream treated as safe because it looked clear. A crowded tent where a soldier with early symptoms kept sleeping beside his comrades, because no one yet realised what was happening to him. Typhoid did not need chaos in the dramatic sense. It needed carelessness repeated often enough, and in the training camps of the Spanish-American War, carelessness had been given enormous room to work. achh.army.mil. By the time the army fully understood the scale of the problem, typhoid had already spread through this mobilised force with extraordinary force. Official army medical histories later recorded 20,926 reported cases of typhoid fever in 1898, resulting in 2,192 deaths, among an army with a mean annual strength of 147,795 men. Those numbers were not perfectly precise. The diagnostic tools of the time were still limited, and some cases were confused with malaria or other fevers. But even allowing for that uncertainty, the conclusion was inescapable. Typhoid was one of the central facts of the war. It was not a side illness, not a minor camp inconvenience, and not merely one disease among many. It was a military disaster in its own right, a chh.army.mil. To understand why it became so destructive, it helps to understand what typhoid fever actually does to a body. The disease often begins in a way that can be mistaken for simple exhaustion. A man develops a headache, he loses his appetite, his limbs feel heavy, he may have abdominal discomfort, constipation, or diarrhea. The fever rises and often stays high. Weakness deepens. In the days before antibiotics, untreated illness could last for weeks, and death rates in the pre-antibiotic era were often above 10%. The disease did not always strike like lightning. It could build slowly, giving both the patient and the officers around him time to misread the early signs. In a military camp where everyone was tired, overheated and eating poorly, a sick man could look merely worn down until the infection had already gone far enough to matter. cdc.gov. That slow beginning was one of typhoid's greatest advantages. A soldier who woke feeling unwell might still report for drill. He might still eat with his company. He might still share water, move among his tent mates, or help prepare camp food if his duties required it. If he had already become infectious, his ordinary movements could help carry danger outward. Army physicians later recognised that failure to diagnose and isolate cases promptly contributed directly to the epidemic. In many places, men with mild early symptoms continued mingling with healthy soldiers. Some convalescents were sent back to their units before doctors understood that recovering patients could continue spreading the disease. Walter Reed and his colleagues on the typhoid board even recognised that a person might carry and transmit infection without ever appearing obviously ill himself. That was a profound insight for the time, and a disturbing one, because it meant the camp could contain sources of infection that no officer could identify simply by looking. A cshh.army.mil. This is where the word inside becomes important. Typhoid was growing inside the army in more than one sense. It was inside the bodies of soldiers, of course, but it was also inside the army's daily systems. It took advantage of how camps were laid out, how food was handled, how sick men were treated, how water was collected, and how authority functioned between medical officers and commanders. The disease spread because the army had gathered large numbers of men quickly, then failed to enforce sanitation with the seriousness the situation required. Later investigations found that typhoid had often been present in units before they reached federal camps because the disease was already common in civilian life in the United States in 1898. Once introduced, it found conditions that encouraged it to expand. cehh.army.mil. At first, many Americans imagined that disease in the war would come from Cuba. The tropics had a terrible reputation. Yellow fever, malaria, and other illnesses were associated with southern ports, humid climates, and foreign campaigns. Those fears were not baseless, and they would become grimly relevant later. But typhoid forced a different recognition. The worst epidemic among American soldiers did not wait for tropical deployment. It flourished in places like Chickamauga, Camp Alger, Jacksonville, Tampa, and other domestic encampments. The real danger was not always exotic. Sometimes it was familiar. Sometimes it was imported not from another country, but from a neighbouring town, a state rendezvous, or a unit already carrying infection when it entered federal service. A chh.army.mil. The camps themselves made the epidemic worse. At Chickamauga, medical officers described large areas around the encampment fouled by human waste, with flies moving from the sinks and surrounding filth to food supplies. Rainwater overflowed latrines and worsened contamination. Filters proved too fragile and slow for large-scale use, so orders were issued to boil water. In the single regiment that rigorously followed those instructions, typhoid had still not appeared by August 7th. That one fact does not explain the whole epidemic, but it does show that prevention was not impossible. It required discipline, inconvenience, and obedience to measures that many men did not yet treat as urgent. achh.army.mil. The flies deserve particular attention because they became central to the Typhoid Board's later conclusions. Surgeon General George M. Sternberg had already warned that flies could carry infectious matter from waste to food, and the camps of 1898 seemed to confirm his fear. Reports spoke of swarms moving from fecal contamination toward kitchens and mess areas. When Reed, Victor Vaughan, and Edward Shakespeare examined the outbreaks after the fact, they concluded that polluted water had played a role, but was not the dominant explanation in many of the camps they studied. They found stronger evidence that flies, contaminated hands, infected bedding, poor segregation of the sick, and careless disposal of waste had all helped spread typhoid. This was not simply a waterborne disaster. It was a disease of camp life in the fullest sense, moving through every weak point in the daily routine. achh.army.mil. Picture a company kitchen in one of those camps. A cook stands over a pot in the heat, trying to prepare food for hungry men who have been drilling for hours. Nearby, bread rests uncovered. Meat is being handled. Men move in and out. The kitchen is not far enough from the filth surrounding the camp. Flies land on waste, then on food. Someone who has helped care for a fever patient handles utensils without washing properly. Another soldier dips water from a stream with hands that are not clean. None of them believes he's participating in an epidemic. Each one is performing a small ordinary act. The tragedy is that epidemics are often built from small ordinary acts repeated on a large scale. The Typhoid Board's findings made that plain. Disease spread through the most practical parts of camp life, because the practical parts had not been made safe. achh.army.mil. The Army also struggled with diagnosis, and that struggle had consequences. At the beginning of the outbreak, some physicians still used older categories such as typhomalaria, a term left over from the Civil War era that blurred together diseases which later medicine would separate more carefully. Others blamed malaria outright. Laboratory confirmation was possible in some cases, but not uniformly available or easily interpreted in the field. The Widal test, then used in diagnosing typhoid, could fail to show the disease clearly until the illness was already advanced. Army historians later noted that medical officers did not distinguish typhoid and malaria effectively in the first months of the Spanish-American War, and that the true character of the epidemic became clear only as it spread. That delay mattered. A disease that is misnamed is harder to fight correctly. achh.army.sil. At Jacksonville, the problem of mistaken diagnosis became especially visible. Some private physicians insisted that many fever cases among soldiers were malaria rather than typhoid. Blood testing suggested otherwise. Army medical history later reported that only about 2% of fever cases in one set of examined patients appeared to be malaria, while typhoid accounted for far more illness than some local practitioners had believed. The confusion was not trivial. If officers believed they were facing malaria, their attention shifted in different directions. If they believed the disease was typhoid, then kitchens, latrines, isolation, water handling, and strict hygiene became urgent. Misdiagnosis did not merely affect labels in a report. It shaped what the Army did next. A chh.army.mil. The burden on hospitals intensified as the epidemic grew. At Chickamauga, by early August, nearly 3,000 officers and enlisted men were sick, not counting those already removed to general hospitals. Many earlier cases had been mild, which allowed the disease to spread more widely before everyone recognised the danger. Later cases appeared more severe. Hospital facilities became overcrowded. Physicians were overworked. Some doctors themselves broke down under the pressure. When cots and tents filled, decisions had to be made about who remained in regimental facilities and who could be moved. The more the hospitals filled, the harder it became to keep infectious patients separated and to maintain order. Typhoid strained not only the sick men's bodies, but the Army's entire capacity to care for them. acach.army.mil. It is easy to read the mortality figure, 2,192 dead, and keep it at a distance. It becomes another number placed beside other numbers. But each death followed a decline that comrades could watch. A man who had arrived in camp looking healthy begins to lose strength. His skin burns with fever. His food goes untouched. He answers slowly. He may become restless or confused. The surgeon checks on him, perhaps more than once a day if the hospital is functioning well, perhaps less often if too many men require attention. Friends from his company ask for news, then return to their tents knowing there may not be much they can do. If he dies, his name moves from a hospital list to a burial list, and in another state a family receives the war's worst message. This was the form of sacrifice the public had not expected. Many of these men did not die under fire. They died because a military camp had become unsafe. Army.mil. One of the most sobering conclusions of the later typhoid board was that as many as 82% of the sick among American troops in the United States may have been suffering from typhoid. That figure is remarkable not merely because it is high, but because it changes the scale of what we are looking at. The camps were not dealing with scattered, unrelated illnesses. They were experiencing a dominant epidemic pattern. Typhoid had become the central medical reality for much of the army at home. It filled reports, crowded hospitals, alarmed commanders, and eventually forced the War Department to investigate not simply how to treat the disease, but how such a widespread breakdown had been allowed to happen. At csh.army.mil. The board's work also exposed an uncomfortable command problem. Medical officers could warn, but they often lacked the authority to compel. Line officers might ignore sanitary recommendations or treat them as secondary concerns. Vaughan later wrote sharply about the ignorance of camp sanitation shown by engineers and line officers at Chickamauga. The board concluded that as long as preventive practices depended entirely on perfect discipline, future epidemics might remain difficult to stop. This realisation helped push the army toward a stronger interest in immunisation, because sanitation alone had failed so badly under wartime conditions. It is striking that the epidemic was not only a medical turning point, but also an administrative one. It forced the army to rethink who had authority over health, and what counted as a combat necessity. acach.army.mil. There is a broader lesson here that the Spanish-American War made impossible to ignore. Soldiers cannot be protected by courage. Courage helps them act under danger. It does not purify water. It does not stop flies. It does not disinfect bedding. It does not distinguish typhoid from malaria. It does not create enough hospital space after an epidemic has already begun. The men of 1898 had courage in abundance. What many camps lacked was disciplined public health. The typhoid epidemic showed that an army can be brave and still be badly managed, patriotic and still vulnerable, eager for battle and yet defeated in part by the habits of its own daily life. acach.army.mil. By late 1898, the damage had become too serious to dismiss. Secretary of War Russell Alger required weekly camp inspections. Greater attention was paid to campsite selection. Commanders became more cautious about massing too many men in one location. The Army's medical leadership had been forced to learn by catastrophe, and those lessons would matter in the years ahead. The fall in typhoid rates after the introduction of more systematic preventive measures, including vaccination in the early 20th century, would later show just how much of the 1898 disaster had been preventable. During World War I, the recorded typhoid rate in the US Army fell dramatically compared with the Spanish-American War, a contrast military medical historians treated as proof that armies did not have to accept typhoid epidemics as inevitable. ach.army.mil. But for the men of 1898, those improvements lay in the future. They lived through the period before the lesson was fully absorbed. They were the evidence from which the lesson was drawn. Typhoid fever moved through the army because the army had not yet learned how seriously to treat sanitation, how quickly to separate the sick, how carefully to protect food, or how much authority public health required in wartime. The disease entered with recruits, settled into camps, followed some men toward transport, and cast a long shadow over the entire conflict. It became the enemy growing inside the army, invisible until the hospitals filled and the death lists lengthened. And while typhoid caused the most severe damage in the camps, it was not the only fever waiting for American soldiers. In Cuba, other diseases would press forward with their own forms of fear, especially the ones associated with tropical climates, mosquitoes, and nights that never seemed to cool enough for the body to recover. Typhoid had shown the army that disease did not need a tropical climate to become deadly. It could begin in Georgia, Virginia, Florida, or Pennsylvania. It could grow in the American camp itself, fed by poor sanitation and the confidence of men who believed the real danger waited somewhere farther south. But once the expedition reached Cuba, another fear took hold, older and more deeply rooted in the military imagination. American soldiers had heard about the fevers of the Caribbean long before they saw the island. They knew that Cuba had a reputation. They knew that armies from Europe had suffered there. They knew that yellow fever, in particular, carried a name that made officers uneasy and families at home anxious. The campaign in Cuba did not create that fear. It gave the fear a place to live. The soldiers did not need to understand mosquitoes to fear tropical disease. Most of them did not. In 1898, the science of transmission was still in motion. The role of mosquitoes in malaria had only just been established, and many army surgeons still believed that malaria spread through contaminated water. Yellow fever remained even more uncertain in their minds. Physicians knew its reputation, its sudden onset, its alarming symptoms, and its history of devastating epidemics, but they did not yet possess a settled field doctrine for preventing it. The visible world around them seemed full of clues and threats. Cuban houses, native huts, blockhouses, refugees from Santiago, damp earth, stagnant places under shade. Any one of them might be blamed when a soldier developed fever. That uncertainty made the disease more frightening, because fear expands quickly when no one can say with confidence where the danger begins or how to stop it. Malaria was, in practical terms, one of the most debilitating illnesses pressing on the Fifth Corps outside Santiago. Army medical history later estimated that 75% or more of the soldiers suffered from some form of the disease, with falciparum malaria apparently the most common. The fever itself might last only 4 to 6 days, but the weakness afterward often kept men from returning to duty. That detail matters. Disease did not have to kill a soldier to damage the campaign. It only had to empty the ranks, reduce marching strength, and leave whole companies unable to move or work with the energy they had possessed when they landed. A regiment could still exist on paper, while a large portion of its men were too weak to perform like soldiers. Quinine was available and used widely, which gave the army at least one meaningful treatment against malaria, yet even that did not produce complete clarity. Doctors often blamed diarrhea and other symptoms on malaria and treated them with quinine as well. Because many still thought malaria came through water, the persistence of fever after soldiers were ordered to boil drinking water led some physicians to assume the men must have disobeyed. In reality, boiling water could not stop mosquitoes from biting exposed troops at dusk or during the night. The army was making efforts, but some of those efforts were aimed at the wrong target. This is one of the most important features of the campaign's medical history. The doctors were not indifferent. They were working hard. But without a firm understanding of transmission, even energetic measures could fail to protect the men who needed them. The camps around Santiago placed soldiers in precisely the sort of environment where malaria could thrive. The men were often encamped outside the city in areas where the habits of the Anopheles mosquito made them especially vulnerable. Their tents and bivouacs did not create a sealed boundary against insects. Rain, mud, poor drainage, and the need to remain near military positions made exposure difficult to avoid. Some soldiers were already exhausted from combat, short rations, and long periods without proper shelter. Malaria entered that weakened setting and deepened it. A man who had endured the march inland and survived battle might then collapse from chills and fever days later, when the great public events of the campaign seemed to be moving toward victory. Yellow fever, however, carried the greater terror. It was not necessarily more widespread than malaria in every setting, and some of the cases diagnosed as yellow fever may have been malaria or another fever. But in the minds of officers, surgeons, and soldiers, yellow fever possessed a special dread. Army medical history later observed that the mere thought of it inspired panic, made worse by the difficulty of distinguishing it from typhoid or malaria in Cuba without sufficient laboratory equipment or physicians trained to make those distinctions reliably. In the field, fever did not arrive neatly labelled. Men became hot, weak, nauseated, jaundiced, delirious, or simply unable to continue. Doctors had to decide what they were seeing, and those decisions affected isolation, hospital placement, and whether entire sites were judged dangerous. The first diagnosed yellow fever case at Siboney appeared on July 6th. Panic gathered quickly afterward. By July 12th, reports claimed that 38 men in the town had been struck down, and General Nelson A. Miles estimated that 100 men had been affected across the island. The spread was blamed in part on troops who had entered buildings believed to be infected despite orders not to do so. Colonel Charles R. Greenleaf, investigating the situation, reported that troops had occupied houses in Siboney, blockhouses and native huts without fumigation or disinfection, and that they had come into contact with refugees from Santiago. From the standpoint of army medical officers at the time, these contacts seemed dangerous and highly suspicious. They were reading the outbreak through the assumptions available to them. This belief that yellow fever clung to buildings and contaminated spaces pushed officers toward drastic action. Siboney was burned. The decision sounds extreme today, but within the medical understanding of July 1898, it seemed to many commanders like a logical response. If the town itself harboured infection, destroying it might stop the outbreak. Major Louis Lagarde supported the measure, even though he believed typhoid posed a greater danger overall and thought many yellow fever cases were comparatively mild. The burning of Siboney did not solve the problem. Fever continued to spread. Later estimates suggested that as many as 1,300 to 1,400 people in the Siboney area may have developed yellow fever despite the destruction, with about 15% dying, although the precise totals remained uncertain. The crucial point is simpler. Fire was used against a disease whose actual method of transmission the army had not yet mastered. A disease that could not be identified confidently also created its own kind of institutional panic. Major Francis J. Ives later complained that surgeons in the field became so alarmed that they labelled almost everything yellow fever. His fear was that men who did not have the disease were being hospitalised alongside men who did, potentially increasing exposure. Whether every part of that criticism was fair is less important than what it reveals. The medical staffs were working under extraordinary pressure, and their choices were shaped by dread. When a fever carried the reputation of yellow fever, overdiagnosis could feel safer than underdiagnosis. No one wanted to be the physician who dismissed a case and allowed a feared epidemic to pass unchecked. Yet overdiagnosis had its own risks, especially when hospital facilities were already strained. The terror of yellow fever extended far beyond Cuba. Officials in the United States worried intensely about the disease returning with troops, mail, money, or cargo. Army medical history noted that mail from Cuba was disinfected before entering the country, and General Miles forbade the circulation of paper money from infected units because it could not be disinfected. The Marine Hospital Service continued inspecting vessels arriving from Cuba, whether they carried soldiers or ordinary commerce. When officers pushed to bring the Fifth Corps home, they did so partly because they feared that if the men remained in Cuba, disease would destroy units that combat had not. Yet bringing them home also raised the fear of importing yellow fever into American ports. The result was a grim tension. Leave the sick in Cuba and many might decline further. Bring them home and officials feared a domestic outbreak. This fear also shaped the creation of Camp Wyckoff at Montauk Point, where returning troops from Cuba and Puerto Rico were isolated until physicians felt confident that yellow fever would not break out among them. The policy tells us how large the dread had become. The war had been won militarily, but tropical disease was treated as if it might still invade the mainland after the fighting ended. Families longing for soldiers to come home discovered that return could mean quarantine, continued illness, and more waiting. Victory had not restored normal life. It had simply shifted the place where disease would be monitored. Inside Cuba, the hospitals struggled to keep pace. At Siboney, the first yellow fever diagnosis on July 6th marked the beginning of a new phase of pressure for Major Lagarde and his staff. The Red Cross cottage staff soon came down with the disease, even though witnesses stated that the building had not been previously contaminated by yellow fever. It was burned anyway. By July 10th, Lagarde had 14 yellow fever patients in tents, including soldiers and civilians. The numbers continued to rise despite the destruction of buildings and efforts to extend the tent hospital. By July 19th, Colonel Benjamin Pope reported that half the sick men in the Fifth Corps had no shelter and that 1,000 additional beds were needed. The difficulty was no longer theoretical. It was counted in men lying without adequate cover while fever worsened around them. Lagarde's burden grew heavier as his own medical team weakened. His facilities overflowed. 3 of his surgeons became ill. The Corps had left him no vehicles for transporting supplies. A proposed floating yellow fever hospital at Siboney appears to have been abandoned. On July 20th, believing that everyone had already been exposed, Lagarde opened the entire tent hospital to yellow fever patients and stopped trying to isolate them beyond placing them in separate wards. That decision was made in desperation, not carelessness. It shows what happens when medical capacity collapses beneath the number of sick. Isolation, in theory, remains desirable. In practice, when there are too many patients and too little room, theory gives way to immediate necessity. Other arrangements followed. A detention camp for suspicious cases was established near Fifth Corps headquarters outside Santiago, and a yellow fever hospital was created nearby. Later, at the beginning of August, a third yellow fever hospital with 150 beds was set up across the bay from Santiago to house new cases from throughout the Corps. Ambulances and wagons used to carry yellow fever patients were disinfected in hopes of preventing further spread. These measures show the army improvising a more organised system after the first wave of confusion. Yet even then, the underlying uncertainty remained. Without a correct understanding of mosquito transmission, some precautions were useful for general cleanliness, but not decisive against the disease officers feared most. Personnel became as urgent a problem as space. Hospital corpsmen were always too few. Volunteers assigned as hospital guards attempted nursing tasks, but few had training and they also had other duties. Fear of yellow fever made recruitment harder. Colonel Greenleaf asked for 500 hospital attendants, 100 nurses immune to yellow fever, and many immune doctors. When General Shafter hesitated to strip manpower from the front, Greenleaf appealed to General Miles, and Shafter was ordered to send the 24th Infantry, one of the black regular regiments, to assist at Siboney with guard duty, police work and nursing chores. Lagarde later credited the discipline of these troops with restoring order, where confusion had taken hold. This work rarely appears in popular accounts of the war, but it mattered immensely. The care of the sick depended not only on surgeons, but on the exhausting daily labour of cleaning, carrying, guarding, feeding and tending. The army also brought in immune or supposedly immune nurses and doctors, many of them women, and many of them black. Colonel Pope used dismissive language in describing some of the female nurses, but the official account also states that they were considered invaluable. None of those nurses contracted yellow fever, though two supposedly immune physicians who arrived with them did. These details illustrate the mix of courage, misconception and necessity that marked medical work in the campaign. Officials believed prior exposure or racial assumptions might offer protection. Some of those beliefs were wrong or unreliable, yet the need for caregivers was so severe that the army continued searching for anyone thought more likely to endure the danger. Malaria and yellow fever therefore affected the campaign in different ways. Malaria weakened enormous numbers of men, often without producing the same immediate public terror. It reduced strength steadily, made units less capable, and sent men into long periods of debility. Yellow fever inspired panic out of proportion to the certainty of diagnosis in many cases, but the panic itself changed decisions. It led to burning towns, moving hospitals, quarantining returnees, disinfecting mail, and accelerating pressure to bring the Corps home. One disease wore the army down, the other haunted it. Both mattered. Both shaped what officers did after the battlefield victories had already been won. There is a temptation to laugh gently at some of the measures taken in 1898, especially the burning of Siboney or the effort to disinfect paper money. That would be unfair. These were decisions made in an atmosphere of fear by people who had partial knowledge, urgent responsibility, and little room for delay. The army was not foolish because it had not yet completed the scientific work that would later define yellow fever transmission. It was living through the moment before that understanding became practical doctrine. The horror of the Cuban campaign helped create the conditions that made later investigation unavoidable. In 1900, the Yellow Fever Commission under Major Walter Reed would pursue the mosquito theory with controlled experiments and ultimately establish the essential role of the insect in transmitting the disease. That discovery came after the war, but the urgency behind it was born in the fevers of Cuba. When the men in Cuba fell ill in July 1898, however, future breakthroughs were of no help. They lay in tents, in crowded hospitals, or under whatever shelter could be arranged. Some had malaria and shivered with chills before the fever rose. Some had typhoid carried from earlier camps or spread through poor sanitation. Some had true yellow fever. Others may have been diagnosed with it because the symptoms were confusing and fear had made certainty harder. To the soldier, these distinctions mattered less than the fact that his strength had vanished. The campaign he had imagined as movement and courage had become stillness, nausea, thirst, weakness, and waiting for a surgeon who had too many men to see. By late July, officers were no longer debating whether the disease threatened the Corps. They were debating how much longer the Corps could remain in Cuba without suffering ruin. Yellow fever, malaria, typhoid, and other fevers had turned the aftermath of victory into a medical emergency. The army had reached Santiago and forced Spain toward defeat, but many of the men who had helped win that campaign were now barely able to march, barely able to stand, or no longer able to care for themselves at all. The visible fighting had receded. The invisible battlefield had not. It had expanded into every hospital tent, every fever ward, every transport decision, and every worried message sent back to Washington, asking for more help than the medical system had been designed to provide. By the middle of July 1898, the 5th Army Corps in Cuba was no longer living through one crisis at a time. Battle had wounded men. Fever had taken hold of others. Rain had soaked blankets and uniforms. Heat had drained strength from bodies already weakened by poor food and long marches. Supplies had landed late, or landed in the wrong order, or remained trapped aboard ships when they were needed on shore. Doctors had come to Cuba prepared to treat injuries from war, but within days they were forced to care for something larger and harder to contain. They were being asked to build a hospital system, while the hospital system was already overflowing. They needed tents before patients arrived, but the patients were there first. They needed nurses before fever spread, but fever had already entered the wards. They needed beds, transport, clean water, surgical tables, medicines, cooking arrangements, trained attendants, and time. Time was the one thing the campaign never seemed willing to give them. At the beginning of the expedition, the medical arrangements had sounded more reassuring on paper than they proved to be in practice. The 5th Corps had organised field hospitals and hospital corps detachments before leaving Tampa. Major Louis Lagarde's reserve hospital, for instance, embarked with 3 medical officers, 1 steward, 2 acting stewards, 17 hospital corps privates, tentage, bedding, and supplies intended for 200 patients. That number seemed sufficient while the army was still thinking in orderly projections. It did not remain sufficient once combat, heat and disease began arriving at the same time. Even Lagarde later admitted that although his unit possessed immediate supplies for its planned role, some stores were insufficient, and the whole structure depended on conditions far more manageable than what Cuba actually provided. The landing itself began the trouble. Hospitals could not be set up properly until their equipment came ashore, but the unloading of medical stores was delayed by confusion in the harbour, limited small boats, and the urgent priority given to ammunition, weapons, and other military necessities. The 1st Divisional Hospital under Major M.W. Wood was carried forward with extraordinary effort, its supplies moved in part by hand and on litters used like improvised barrows. The reserve hospital aboard the Saratoga, which would become the base hospital at Siboney, took far longer to establish. Medical officers later described the bitterness of knowing that equipment existed nearby, still aboard ships, while men on shore had to be treated without it. One can understand the frustration. A surgeon facing wounded soldiers does not care that a crate of hospital supplies technically belongs to his department if it remains somewhere offshore, unreachable, when the fevered and bleeding are already at hand. The first great rush came after the fighting at Las Guasimas, and then with much greater force after El Caney and San Juan Hill. By the end of July 1st, the army had suffered the overwhelming majority of its battlefield wounds in the Santiago campaign. Hospital arrangements that had been planned for a few hundred men suddenly had to absorb numbers far beyond that expectation. In Siboney, wounded soldiers reached the base hospital in large waves. The heat was intense. The hospital ship Olivet was not yet available in the harbour when some of the injured arrived, and there was no tentage ready to cover everyone. Major Frank Ives later wrote that an old, dilapidated building had to be used because there was no better shelter available at the moment. The choice was not between ideal and poor. It was between poor and nothing. A man with a gunshot wound could not be left under the naked sun while officers debated architectural standards. He was carried inside whatever space could hold him. The wounded filled the hospitals quickly, but the doctors understood that fever would not wait politely outside while surgical cases were handled first. Malaria, typhoid, diarrheal disease, and suspected yellow fever were moving through the force. The distinction between the wounded and the sick mattered medically, but in terms of hospital burden they competed for the same scarce beds, the same exhausted staff, and the same shelter. One tent could not be in 2 places at once. A nurse tending a delirious fever patient could not simultaneously assist in surgery. An ambulance transporting wounded from the front could not also carry every soldier too weak from fever to walk. As July advanced, military medicine in Cuba became an exercise in triage before anyone used the word casually. Not every need could be met. Not every patient could receive ideal care. The staff had to decide constantly where their limited strength would do the most good. The shortage of personnel was as serious as the shortage of equipment. The medical department had not been built for an emergency of this scale. Volunteer regiments brought surgeons and a few hospital stewards, while the regular army had its own system of physicians and attendants. But the campaign demanded more than the existing structure could deliver. There had been plans to concentrate hospital corps men into larger companies directly under medical control, which would have helped create a more flexible and disciplined service. The organisation was authorised, but embarkation interrupted it before the work could be completed. That meant the medical system entered Cuba still partly arranged around older, less efficient patterns, at the very moment when it needed centralised authority and coordinated manpower most. This helps explain why doctors often sound so strained in their reports. They were not merely complaining about inconvenience, they were trying to practice medicine with too few trained hands. At Siboney, Colonel Charles Greenleaf requested large numbers of additional hospital attendants, immune nurses, and doctors believed to be less vulnerable to yellow fever. The yellow fever hospital had to be expanded with every scrap of available tentage. 2 immune medical officers were taken from the hospital ship relief for duty ashore. Greenleaf later wrote that the conditions made it impossible to provide the care and attention the sick deserved, while also insisting that he had never seen army medical officers labour with more zeal or self-sacrifice. That pairing of admissions matters. The care was inadequate, and the people delivering it were often heroic. Both statements can be true at once. The surgeons themselves were working at a pace that would have broken many people. Some had to operate for long stretches with little rest. Others moved between fever wards, surgical shelters, and administrative duties, trying to maintain records, request supplies, locate transportation, and answer the demands of commanders. Cuba's hospitals were not quiet rooms where physicians stepped calmly from one polished bedside to another. They were crowded, hot, damp, noisy, and often improvised. Men groaned, flies gathered, dressings had to be changed, buckets needed emptying, water had to be carried, laundry piled up. New patients arrived before old ones had left. Behind every dramatic surgical act stood dozens of repetitive tasks, and if those tasks were not done, the hospital itself became another source of danger. The wounded often received more public attention because wounds were visible and easy to connect to combat, but the sick eventually became harder to ignore simply because there were too many of them. In some hospital settings, even a large staff could not keep the environment thoroughly clean. One later, Army account described a facility whose workforce included a hospital director, a volunteer medical officer, 5 contract surgeons, several stewards, 30 hospital corps privates, 30 female contract nurses, 10 Red Cross nurses, and 2 additional volunteer nurses. Yet even that collection of personnel was insufficient to maintain proper cleanliness under the demands placed upon it. That sentence is worth lingering over. It means the problem was not a lack of compassion. It was scale. When disease and wounds arrive in a flood, even capable people begin losing the battle against filth, fatigue, and time. Women nurses became indispensable during this crisis, despite earlier hesitation within military circles about how and where to use them. At the outbreak of the war, the Surgeon General's office had been flooded with applications from women offering to care for sick and wounded soldiers. The army was initially unprepared to make full use of that outpouring. But as conditions worsened in Cuba and later at Montauk Point, female contract nurses and Red Cross nurses became essential to the medical response. Their work was not decorative assistance at the edge of the real story. They provided skilled, exhausting, direct patient care in environments where lives depended on basic nursing competence. They fed men too weak to lift themselves, cleaned them, monitored symptoms, changed dressings, and helped create order in wards that could otherwise slide toward chaos. Some male officers had doubted whether women belonged in such settings. Experience changed that. Major Francis Ives, who had reservations earlier, later conceded the value of female nurses in Cuba. other reports described them as efficient and invaluable. These judgments did not emerge from polite sentiment. They emerged from pressure. The army needed people who could nurse, and the women who came proved they could do it under wartime conditions. This would matter beyond the campaign itself. The Spanish-American War helped demonstrate the need for a more formal nursing structure in the army, and the years that followed brought institutional change, including the authorization of the Army Nurse Corps in 1901. The beds in Cuba and Montauk helped make that future possible, because they made the cost of inadequate nursing impossible to dismiss. The army also relied on soldiers who were rarely placed at the centre of this medical story. When the yellow fever crisis at Siboney intensified, General Shafter was ordered to send the 24th Infantry, a regiment of black regular troops, to assist Major Lagarde. These men performed guard duty, police work and nursing chores in a hospital environment that many feared. Lagarde later credited their discipline with bringing order to a situation that had become nearly unmanageable. Their contribution matters because it reveals who kept the medical system functioning when the formal structure was fraying. Not only surgeons, not only nurses, also enlisted men doing the exhausting support work without which hospitals could not operate at all: cleaning, carrying, maintaining order, standing watch, assisting the sick when others hesitated. The history of saving lives is often filled with people whose names do not appear in the headline, but whose labour made the headline possible. There were ships, too, floating extensions of the hospital system that became vital when shore facilities could not cope. The Olivet functioned as a hospital ship during the campaign, and the Relief, which arrived later, was outfitted as a general hospital and instructed to receive sick and wounded from both the Army and Navy. The Relief was loaded with 1,000 cots and large quantities of hospital supplies. Lagarde later wrote that, although his team had managed to care for the wounded before its arrival, the ship brought a level of equipment that the shore hospitals badly needed. To a feverish soldier, a cot may not seem like a grand technological advance, but after lying on the ground or on inadequate bedding in a damp, crowded hospital, a clean cot is not trivial. It is dignity, rest, and often a better chance of recovery. The hospital ships also made clear how desperately the army needed a system for evacuation, not just treatment. A sick or wounded man in Cuba was not merely a medical case. He was part of a logistics problem stretching from frontline camp to shore, from shore to transport, from transport to quarantine or hospital back in the United States. If he could not be moved safely, he remained in overburdened facilities. If he was moved too quickly, he might deteriorate aboard a poorly equipped vessel. If he carried contagious disease, his transportation raised fresh worries. The evacuation of the sick and wounded was therefore not a simple act of compassion. It was a military operation in itself, requiring ships, staffing, records, supplies, and careful judgment about who could travel. The war exposed how underdeveloped that system still was. The numbers of patients were not the only source of anguish. The uncertainty surrounding diagnosis complicated everything. Yellow fever, malaria, typhoid, and other fevers did not always present neatly enough for overwhelmed physicians to distinguish them immediately. A patient believed to have yellow fever might be isolated differently. A suspected typhoid case required a different set of precautions. A malarial fever might be treated with quinine. A wound complicated by infection needed surgical attention. The doctors were making these decisions while too many bodies lay before them, and too much information remained uncertain. Modern readers may wish they had been more precise. The physicians wished the same thing. But precision is hardest when institutions are under strain, and the clock is measured in new patients arriving. Food and water remained constant concerns inside the hospitals. Sick men could not survive on patriotic feeling, and many needed diets different from the standard soldier's ration. The Red Cross and other voluntary organisations stepped into these gaps, providing supplies and assistance where official systems were too slow or too rigid. This voluntary aid became especially important in Cuba and later at Montauk Point. Yet even generous relief could not fully compensate for lack of coordination. One later, Army history observed that voluntary assistance was sometimes lavish, but not always well integrated with the medical department. That sounds technical, but the consequence was deeply human. Supplies might exist, yet not arrive at the right ward. Helpers might be willing, yet not placed where the need was greatest. Charity mattered, but organisation mattered too. The setting at Siboney captures this better than any abstract explanation. The hospital there became a place where nearly every weakness of the campaign met. It was close enough to receive wounded men from fighting, close enough to accumulate fever patients, and important enough that everyone depended on it. Yet it suffered from delayed supplies, insufficient transport, inadequate shelter, fear of yellow fever, overworked staff and shortages of personnel. When reports speak of loose tentage being gathered from wherever it could be found, or of hospital capacity expanded in desperate increments, they reveal a system improvising under pressure rather than functioning by design. Each new tent represented some relief, but also a confession that the earlier arrangement had not been enough. There is something deeply sobering about the phrase "too many men to save," not because the doctors stopped trying, but because the war repeatedly presented them with more suffering than the existing arrangements could absorb properly. Most wounded soldiers in the Santiago campaign survived their injuries, and the army took pride in that record. Yet even the statistics were debated, with contradictory reports about mortality among the wounded in some hospitals. Numbers can be arranged to comfort or alarm depending on which set one uses. What remains beyond dispute is that the medical system in Cuba was strained to the edge by the combined weight of combat casualties and disease. The doctors, nurses, attendants, and hospital workers saved many. They also watched others slip away because the conditions around them were too harsh, the disease too advanced, or the resources too few. In the middle of that pressure, the work continued hour by hour. A surgeon washed his hands as best he could and returned to the table. A nurse dampened a cloth for a fevered forehead. A hospital corps man lifted one end of a stretcher, then another, then another. A soldier from the 24th Infantry carried refuse away from the hospital grounds because cleanliness itself had become a medical duty. Someone counted blankets. Someone argued for more tents. Someone waited for the relief to arrive. Someone wrote a report late at night trying to record the situation clearly enough that people far away in Washington would understand it. All of them were part of the same struggle, not against Spain now, or not only against Spain, but against collapse, against the point where a hospital stops being a place of care and becomes another scene of uncontrolled suffering. This is why the medical side of the Spanish-American War deserves more than a passing sentence. It showed the limits of bravery when preparation failed. It showed the limits of skill when supplies could not arrive. It showed the limits of supplies when trained hands were missing. It showed the limits of individual devotion when systems had been allowed to remain too small for the emergency placed upon them. The physicians in Cuba did not lack dedication. The nurses did not lack stamina. The attendants did not lack effort. What they lacked, again and again, was enough of everything else. Enough shelter, enough beds, enough transport, enough organisation, enough time. And still, men survived because of them. That also matters. It would be wrong to tell this part of the story only as a record of failure. The medical staff improvised hospitals where none had properly existed. They converted ships into wards. They brought wounded men through mud and heat. They treated fevers they could not always classify perfectly. They demanded more help, and when help arrived, they used it. They relied on nurses, volunteers, black regulars, and the Red Cross. They made a chaotic system function better than it had any right to function under those circumstances. Their work did not erase the suffering, it prevented even more of it. By late summer, the truth was becoming impossible to avoid. The American army had won battles in Cuba, but many of the men who had fought them were sick, weak, or dependent on overstretched hospitals. Reports of courage from the hills around Santiago now existed beside reports of fever wards, overcrowded facilities, and urgent pleas for evacuation. The human cost of the war was no longer measured only in the dead from combat. It was measured in hospital tents that could not be erected quickly enough, in cots that arrived too late for some, in nurses working through exhaustion, in surgeons unable to give every patient the care they believed he deserved. The hospitals made visible what the disease had been saying all along. The greater danger in this war was not confined to the firing line. It had spread into the very machinery meant to keep the army alive. By the time the Spanish-American War entered its final weeks, the most unsettling truth about it was becoming impossible to hide. The United States had defeated Spain rapidly in the field and at sea. American forces had taken Manila Bay, fought their way toward Santiago, and watched the Spanish fleet destroyed while attempting to escape the harbour. The war still looked victorious from a distance. It still appeared to fit the cheerful phrase later attached to it, a splendid little war. Yet inside the casualty lists, a different history was forming. The number of Americans dying from disease was rising far beyond the number killed by Spanish weapons. The war was being won in the newspapers, in the harbours, and on the hills outside Santiago. But in the hospitals, in the camps, on the transport ships, and in the records of the dead, disease had already become the more effective killer. The precise totals vary depending on which wartime report or later consolidated count is used, and that variation is worth being honest about. An official Surgeon General report drawing on returns available through September 30th, 1898, stated that 345 American servicemen had been killed or died of wounds, while 2,485 had died of disease. Later casualty summaries commonly give a broader war total of about 385 combat deaths and 2,061 deaths from disease and accidents. Those totals do not match perfectly because the categories and cut-off dates differ, but the meaning does not change. Under every serious accounting, disease killed several times more Americans than Spanish bullets did. One later Army medical history described the ratio as roughly 5 deaths from disease for every death from battle injury during the Spanish-American War. It is difficult to think of another comparison that so sharply overturns the popular memory of the conflict. The war is remembered through action because action is easier to picture. A naval squadron steaming into battle can be painted. A cavalryman charging uphill can be turned into legend. A flag planted after a hard fight can be taught in classrooms for generations. Fever is harder to commemorate. No artist can easily make a heroic engraving of contaminated water. There is no triumphant sculpture of a hospital cot. A burial form listing typhoid as the cause of death does not look like the raw material of national mythology. Yet for many American families in 1898, that was the war they received. Their sons did not die on the crest of San Juan Heights. They died after weeks of fever in camps at home or in hospitals filled with men whose bodies had been undone by illnesses most of them never expected to face. The shock becomes sharper when we remember that the United States had gone to war with confidence. Volunteers entered service believing they might be tested by combat, hardship, and perhaps by the climate of Cuba, but few imagined that the deadliest danger would often be found before combat or after victory. In the training camps, typhoid spread through water, flies, food, bedding, and human contact. In Cuba, malaria, yellow fever, diarrhea, dysentery, and typhoid pressed on troops already weakened by heat, mud, hunger, and exhaustion. The medical department treated wounds with more success than armies had managed in earlier wars, thanks to improved knowledge of infection and antiseptic practice. But disease took advantage of problems that surgery could not solve. Badly organised camps, shortages of supplies, insufficient transport, confused authority, and delays in recognising how illnesses were spreading. The rifle wound was increasingly manageable. The camp itself was not. General William Shafter, commanding the American expedition in Cuba, eventually put the matter more bluntly than statistics ever could. He described disease as a force 1,000 times harder to stand up against than the missiles of the enemy. That phrase has endured because it captures the soldiers' reality better than the official numbers alone. A bullet may come from a direction, it may miss, it may strike once. Disease was everywhere and nowhere. It could be in the water a man drank because he was desperate with thirst. It could be in the mosquito that found him at dusk. It could be carried invisibly by a comrade who appeared healthy. It could linger in a camp long after the battle that brought men there had ended. Spanish fire could be met with courage and cover. Fever did not care whether a man was brave. The typhoid epidemic made this imbalance clearest. The Army's later medical histories recorded more than 20,000 cases among American soldiers during the war, with over 2,000 deaths in one official tally. A separate scholarly reconstruction of the epidemic in the assembly camps counted 20,738 cases, 1,590 deaths, and concluded that typhoid accounted for 87% of disease deaths in those camps. These figures differ because they describe related but not identical populations, but together they show the scale of the catastrophe. Typhoid was not a minor nuisance hidden behind the larger war. It was one of the largest American killers of the conflict, and in the camps at home, it was often the central medical event of the entire mobilization. The idea that the camps at home could be deadlier than the battlefield abroad unsettled people then, and it still should. The word home usually carries a sense of safety. The soldiers in those camps had not yet reached Cuba. Many had not seen the enemy. They were surrounded by their own officers, their own surgeons, their own cooks, their own supply systems, and their own nation's effort to prepare them. Yet those conditions proved lethal. The National Archives has highlighted burial correspondence for 181 soldiers from this period, noting that all but a handful died of typhoid and none died in combat. That collection is only a small slice of the larger disaster, but it gives the statistics faces. It reminds us that every one of those disease totals became a name that had to be written down, a grave that had to be paid for, a family that had to receive notice. Disease deaths also exposed a painful mismatch between expectation and reality. A family saying goodbye to a young volunteer in 1898 might have imagined him facing danger in a recognizable form. They might have feared a Spanish rifle, a shell from a fort, perhaps even the sea crossing. They likely did not picture him lying in a fever hospital at Camp Thomas or Camp Alger, his strength draining away because latrines had been badly managed and flies had carried contamination toward his food. The language of honour and sacrifice still applied, but it collided with anger and disbelief. These were deaths in service, certainly. But many Americans began asking whether some of them had been unnecessary, whether enough had been done, whether the government had gathered men more quickly than it had prepared to keep them alive. President William McKinley recognized that public anger could not simply be waved aside. In September 1898, when he addressed the commission appointed to investigate the War Department's conduct, he said that the people were entitled to know whether the citizens who had answered the call of duty had been neglected, misused, or maltreated by the government. He added that if wrongs had been committed, those responsible should not escape conviction and punishment. Those words did not come from a president speaking in a vacuum. They came after reports of sick camps, bad food controversies, hospital failures, and the alarming realization that disease had taken a greater toll than the enemy. The commission, often called the Dodge Commission, was not formed simply because the war had been hard. It was formed because too much suffering seemed to have come from American failures rather than Spanish strength. There is a tendency, when looking back, to divide wartime deaths into clean categories. Battle deaths are treated as central. Disease deaths are placed off to the side, as though they belong more to medicine than to war. The Spanish-American War refuses that division. Disease altered decisions at the highest levels of command. It drove calls to remove the Fifth Corps from Cuba. It shaped quarantine policy in the United States. It influenced the creation of hospitals and detention camps. It forced the Army to examine sanitation, transportation, nursing, and medical authority. Disease was not separate from strategy. It became strategy's limit. A force riddled with fever could not be used as though it remained at full strength. Commanders had to think about withdrawal and evacuation not because Spain had broken them, but because illness threatened to do what combat had not. In Cuba, the imbalance between battlefield success and medical collapse became particularly stark. The dramatic victories of July 1st at El Caney and San Juan Hill had already occurred. Santiago would surrender on July 17th. Yet during and after this victorious period, fever cases multiplied. By late July, the army was contending with thousands of sick men, while officers and surgeons struggled to determine how much of the danger came from yellow fever, malaria, typhoid, or other illnesses. The battles had ended in recognizable triumph. The suffering had not. The physicians who had successfully treated wounds found themselves facing a surge of disease that did not care that the campaign was militarily successful. Army medical history later summarized the experience plainly. For troops actively involved in hostilities, the greatest tragedy had been produced by disease. That sentence deserves to be taken slowly. The greatest tragedy had been produced by disease, not the roughness of the fighting, though the fighting was real, not the courage of Spanish defence, though that defence was real, not the confusion of the battlefield, though that confusion harmed many. Disease, the thing invisible until its effects became overwhelming, the thing that grew in filthy camps and crowded hospitals, the thing that no medal could quite address. When an army wins the war but loses more men to fever than to its armed opponent, the meaning of victory becomes more complicated. It does not disappear. Spain still lost. The United States still gained power and territory, but triumph sits beside waste, and the waste cannot be erased by the final map. This is especially important because the Spanish-American War was brief. In a longer war, disease deaths might accumulate over years. Here, the damage mounted within months. The speed of the campaign can mislead us into assuming the human toll was modest or easily contained. It was modest compared with the Civil War, certainly, or compared with the world wars that followed. But for a conflict that ran so quickly, the disease burden was enormous. Official figures available by late September 1898 already counted more than 7 disease deaths for every man killed or fatally wounded in battle. Even later consolidated counts, which use different categories, still preserve the same stark imbalance. The war's compressed timeline makes the disease toll more revealing, not less. It shows how quickly an inadequately prepared army could be medically overwhelmed. The deaths themselves were only part of the cost. Tens of thousands more became sick without dying. Illness removed men from duty, disrupted units, burdened hospitals, and complicated transport. It consumed medical attention that might otherwise have gone toward wounded soldiers or more ordinary care. A regiment does not need to bury half its men to become ineffective. It only needs enough of them feverish, weak, or recovering that the unit loses its usable strength. This was true in Cuba, where malaria and other fevers weakened formations after the major fighting. It was true in the camps, where typhoid outbreaks filled hospital wards and slowed the army's ability to prepare or deploy men. The scale of non-fatal sickness is one reason the disease story cannot be measured only by death totals. Disease killed more than bullets, yes. It also disabled far more than it killed. There was also a difference in how people grieved. A battlefield death can become a story told repeatedly within a family. There is a location, an action, sometimes a witness. A disease death often arrives as a sequence of uncertainty. First, a letter saying he is unwell. Then perhaps no letter for several days. Then, an official notice. Maybe he died at a camp hundreds of miles from home, or in a Cuban hospital no relative ever saw, or after evacuation to a facility where the family could not reach him in time. The bureaucratic language of wartime administration did not match the intimate confusion of those households. To the War Department, the death entered a category. to the family, the story may have remained unfinished, lacking the clear shape that people often need in order to make grief bearable. And then there was the way disease challenged the idea of masculine endurance that so many soldiers carried into the war. Men could prepare themselves mentally to be brave under fire. They could promise not to run, not to shame their regiment, not to shrink from battle. But fever attacked in a way that could not be conquered by will. A man could be strong one week and helpless the next. He could hate being tended, hate being unable to rise, hate needing water brought to him, hate the knowledge that his company marched without him. Disease stripped away the performance of toughness that military culture prized. It reduced men to weakness in front of their comrades and then asked them to endure that weakness without any guarantee that endurance would save them. This psychological humiliation rarely appears in casualty statistics, but it was part of the war's medical reality. The officers themselves recognised that disease was harder to stand against than enemy fire precisely because bravery had so little leverage over it. The contrast also changed how the work of doctors and nurses should be understood. Their task was not only to repair the damage caused by battle. Increasingly, they were confronting the main source of death in the war. In Cuba, surgeons treated gunshot wounds with a degree of success that reflected medical progress since the Civil War. Yet the war's overall mortality story was dominated by disease, which meant the nurses cleaning fever wards, the attendants carrying water, the physicians diagnosing typhoid, the staff organising quarantines, and the investigators tracing infection routes were dealing with the conflict's deadliest enemy. The popular war story tends to place them behind the soldiers. The numbers suggest they were standing directly in front of the greatest threat. The later Typhoid Board, led by Walter Reed with Victor Vaughan and Edward Shakespeare, was created because the army could not ignore what disease had done. The board studied the origin and spread of typhoid fever in military camps, concluding that the epidemic had moved through failures of sanitation, contamination, flies, contact, and inadequate control of the sick. Its work helped shift the medical understanding of camp disease away from resignation and toward prevention. President McKinley's broader investigating commission responded to the same atmosphere of disquiet, examining whether soldiers had been neglected or mistreated. These inquiries were not mere administrative housekeeping after an easy victory. They were a response to a war whose death toll had exposed the limits of the army's preparation. There is something almost bitter in the timing. The United States emerged from the Spanish-American War with greater international power, but also with a humiliating lesson about the vulnerability of its military systems. It had demonstrated naval strength and expeditionary ambition. It had also shown that a modernising nation could still send men into camps where disease spread on a vast scale. The public image of triumph and the medical evidence of failure existed at the same time. One does not cancel the other. Instead, they belong together. The war proved that the United States could project power overseas. It also proved that power projection without sanitation, nursing capacity, transport planning, and medical authority could turn inward and injure the very soldiers meant to embody national strength. So when we say disease killed more soldiers than Spanish bullets, we are not repeating a grim trivia point. We are naming the central contradiction of the war. The conflict was short, but the medical suffering was immense. The battlefield victories were real, but they did not define the majority of American deaths. The war was celebrated, but it also provoked investigations because too many men had been lost in ways that appeared avoidable. Typhoid in the camps, malaria and yellow fever in Cuba, the overcrowded hospitals, the overwhelmed medical staff, and the bewildered families at home all belong inside the same story as Manila Bay and Santiago. Without them, the war becomes too clean, too bright, too easy to admire from a safe distance. And by the end of 1898, some officials understood that the true question was no longer only how the United States had defeated Spain. It was how so many Americans had died without Spanish bullets ever touching them, and whether those deaths might force the army to change. The casualty lists had made the argument already. The disease wards had made it more clearly still. The men buried after fever had made it impossible to dismiss. The war had ended, but the reckoning had not. It was only beginning to take shape in reports, commissions, and a new determination among some physicians that no future army should be allowed to learn the same lesson in the same terrible way. The war ended before the sickness did. That is one of the hardest things to understand about the Spanish-American War if we are used to imagining conflicts as stories with clean closing scenes. A surrender is signed, a flag comes down, a fleet is defeated, soldiers are told they have won, newspapers announce victory, families begin waiting for homecomings. But disease does not care about treaties. A fever does not stop because diplomats have begun arguing over borders. A hospital ward does not empty because the public has turned its attention towards celebration. When the guns quieted in 1898, thousands of American soldiers were still sick, many of them too weak to travel easily, others already on ships bound north, and still others in camps at home where typhoid continued to burn through the ranks. The war was over in the political sense. The medical reckoning had only begun. Some of the most painful scenes came after the victorious army started returning from Cuba. The men of the 5th Corps had fought at Las Guasimas, El Caney, and San Juan Heights, endured the siege of Santiago, and watched Spain's position in eastern Cuba collapse. They had done what had been asked of them. Yet by the time they were sent home, many were gaunt, feverish, and visibly worn down by the campaign. American authorities feared yellow fever might travel back with them, so returning troops were directed to Camp Wyckoff at Montauk Point, Long Island, a remote quarantine and recuperation camp created in haste during August 1898. The site was chosen in part because its location made it easier to isolate soldiers while monitoring for disease. But the camp quickly became another symbol of the army's difficulty caring for sick men on a large scale. Men arrived weak from Cuba, and the systems waiting for them were not always ready. Camp Wyckoff was not another battlefield, but the public reacted to it with growing outrage because it looked like a place where victory had been followed by neglect. Families travelled there desperate to find sons and husbands. Volunteers arrived with food, clothing, and supplies. Newspaper correspondents reported scenes of confusion, shortages, and sick men lying in conditions that seemed shocking after the triumphal tone of the war news. Some accounts were exaggerated, and military authorities insisted that criticism often ignored how difficult the situation had been. Still, the basic problem was real. The army had not simply brought home soldiers. It had brought home a mass of exhausted, ill, and undernourished men who needed organised recovery at a scale the military had not adequately prepared to provide. The image of returning heroes passing through a disease camp complicated the nation's celebration. This discomfort reached the highest levels of government. President William McKinley appointed a commission under Grenville M. Dodge to investigate the conduct of the War Department. The inquiry examined many aspects of the war, including supply failures, camp management, and medical operations. It did not conclude that every criticism of the army was justified, and the majority of commissioners did not hold Secretary of War Russell Alger personally responsible for the failures of the conflict. But the commission did identify serious weaknesses and recommended reforms meant to strengthen the army's medical capacity in future wars. The fact that such an investigation was necessary tells us something important. The disease crisis had become too visible to dismiss as mere misfortune. It had created a public question about responsibility. The Dodge Commission's conclusions were not simply about one badly managed summer. They revealed that the Army Medical Department had entered the war too small, too lightly staffed, and too dependent on improvisation once mobilization began. Later, Army medical histories summarized the problem in plain language. Many medical officers performed admirable work individually, but the department as a whole had been organized for peace and minor expeditions, not for the sudden demands of a major wartime mobilization. The Commission called for a larger force of commissioned medical officers, stronger hospital corps support, and improved administrative organization. These were not glamorous recommendations. They did not sound like the dramatic lessons of war found in speeches about courage or patriotism. Yet they were among the most important lessons the conflict produced. An army that could not protect the health of its own men was not fully prepared for modern war. The typhoid epidemic forced an even more specific investigation. In August 1898, the Army created a typhoid fever board made up of Walter Reed, Victor C. Vaughan, and Edward O. Shakespeare. Their task was to determine how the disease had spread through American camps and what could be done to prevent a repetition. The board's work became one of the defining medical studies of the period. It examined camps, troop movements, water sources, latrines, hospital practices, and the behaviour of infected men. Its findings pushed the army away from vague explanations and toward a much more concrete understanding of camp disease. Typhoid had not spread merely because men were unlucky, or because war always brought sickness. It had spread because sanitation had failed, infected recruits had entered crowded camps, waste had been poorly controlled, flies had carried contamination, and sick men had not always been separated effectively from the healthy. That conclusion mattered deeply. It turned typhoid from a shadowy wartime affliction into a preventable military disaster. The board's work demonstrated that the layout of a camp, the cleanliness of kitchens, the management of latrines, the isolation of patients, and the authority given to medical officers could directly influence how many soldiers lived or died. This may seem obvious now, but in 1898 it represented a major shift in emphasis. The army had long understood that disease accompanied campaigns. The typhoid board helped make the case that disease could be fought deliberately, and that failure to do so was not merely unfortunate but negligent. It was one of the moments when public health entered military thinking with greater force. The lessons were not absorbed overnight. That is another part of the story worth telling, honestly. After the war, Congress did not suddenly transform the medical department into a fully modern institution. Army medical historians later noted that lawmakers remained reluctant for years to expand the department, enough to guarantee a large reserve of trained and experienced personnel for future emergencies. The suffering of 1898 produced recommendations and some reform, but institutions move unevenly. Bureaucracies defend old habits. Budgets become arguments. Memories fade once immediate outrage softens. The fever camps had demonstrated the danger clearly, yet the army still had to struggle to convert that painful knowledge into permanent structure. Even so, some changes did take hold, and one of the most consequential involved nursing. During the war, the army had relied heavily on contract nurses, many of them women, to meet the overwhelming need in hospitals at home and abroad. Their service in Cuba, in domestic camps, and in recovery centres such as Montauk showed beyond argument that trained nurses were essential in military medicine. Dr. Anita Newcomb McGee, who had played a central role in organising women nurses for army service during the conflict, later submitted a proposal for a permanent nurse corps. Congress incorporated that idea into the Army Reorganisation Act of 1901, and on February 2nd of that year the Army Nurse Corps was officially created. This was one of the clearest institutional legacies of the Spanish-American War's disease crisis. Fever wards had made the need undeniable. The creation of the Army Nurse Corps did not instantly solve every problem in military care, and it did not erase the barriers that still existed, including those faced by black nurses seeking acceptance within Army and Red Cross systems. But it marked a major change in what the army was willing to acknowledge. Nursing was no longer something to be assembled hurriedly when disaster arrived. It was a profession that had to be built into the military system itself. The men who had suffered in overcrowded hospitals and the women who had tended them through exhaustion and fever helped force that recognition. Their work became part of the army's permanent structure. The post-war medical legacy also extended beyond typhoid. Cuba remained under American military occupation after Spain's defeat, and the diseases that had frightened troops during the campaign continued to shape policy there. Yellow fever in particular remained a major concern. Major Walter Reed, who had already served on the typhoid board, later led the Army's Yellow Fever Commission in Cuba. Building on the earlier mosquito theory advanced by Cuban physician Carlos Finley, Reed and his colleagues carried out controlled experiments at Camp Lazia in 1900 and demonstrated that yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes rather than by contaminated clothing or ordinary contact with infected buildings. The research was conducted at a site carefully chosen to eliminate outside sources of infection and became one of the landmark achievements in the history of infectious disease. This discovery changed not only medicine, but also the practical management of cities and armies. If mosquitoes spread yellow fever, then burning buildings, fumigating clothing, or fearing paper money as a carrier could no longer serve as the main strategy. The focus had to shift toward mosquito control, screening, water management, and sanitation, aimed at eliminating breeding sites. William C. Gorgas, later made Chief Sanitary Officer for Havana under the American occupation, drew on this new understanding in a campaign to reduce yellow fever in the city. His work demonstrated that organised public health measures could suppress a disease long treated almost as an unavoidable curse of the tropics. The Spanish-American War had exposed ignorance and fear around yellow fever. The occupation period began turning that fear into actionable knowledge. Not everyone accepted the new science immediately. Army medical history notes that even after Gorgas achieved impressive results in Havana, some officials and medical men continued to reject the idea that mosquitoes transmitted yellow fever and malaria. That resistance is important because it reminds us that evidence alone does not instantly remake institutions. New knowledge has to win arguments. It has to overcome reputation, habit, and pride. The history of disease after the Spanish-American War was therefore not a smooth march from ignorance to enlightenment. It was a contested process in which hard-won discoveries had to prove themselves again and again. The practical implications eventually reached far beyond Cuba. The methods refined through Reed's findings and Gorgas's sanitary work later shaped disease control campaigns in Panama during the Canal era. That wider legacy does not belong solely to the Spanish-American War, but the war helped create the urgency that made those later achievements possible. The fever panic in Cuba, the confusion at Siboney, and the deaths that followed the campaign pushed army physicians to demand better answers. When those answers came, they reshaped tropical medicine and public health in the American sphere of influence. Typhoid prevention also entered a new phase in the years after the war. The medical department did not stop at sanitation reports. It pursued vaccination. Army historical sources later emphasized that anti-typhoid vaccination became one of the important preventive achievements in military medicine after 1898. By the early 20th century, the Army was supplying large amounts of vaccine not only to its own forces, but also to the Navy, National Guard units, and other public bodies. Surgeon General George H. Tawney later ranked typhoid vaccination among the great sanitary achievements of the medical department since the Spanish-American War. That judgment makes sense only when we remember what typhoid had done in 1898. The vaccine represented more than laboratory success. It represented an attempt to close the door through which the disease had marched so freely during the war. The improvement became visible in later military experience. During the Spanish-American War, the Army recorded 20,926 typhoid cases and 2,192 deaths, in a force with a mean annual strength of 147,795. By the time the United States entered World War I, anti-typhoid vaccination and stronger preventive systems had transformed the picture. Army medical histories use that contrast to show that the losses of 1898 were not inevitable. They belonged to a particular moment before sanitation and immunization had been integrated properly into military practice. Future soldiers benefited from lessons purchased at terrible cost by the men who fell sick in the camps of 1898. This is one of the more difficult truths about reform. The people who benefit are usually not the people who suffered first. A young soldier in a later war receives a vaccine because another young soldier once died before the army understood how much prevention mattered. A nurse enters a permanent army corps because women in makeshift fever wards prove that their skill could not remain an afterthought. A sanitary officer insists on camp discipline because another camp once became a reservoir of infection. Institutions often learn in this way by translating memory into procedure. The Spanish-American War left behind those procedures, but only after disease had written the lesson painfully enough that officials could no longer ignore it. There is also a change in the meaning of military professionalism that emerges after 1898. Before the war, it was possible for some officers to think of camp cleanliness as secondary, even fussy, compared with drilling, manoeuvre and combat readiness. After the disease disasters, that distinction became harder to defend. Sanitation was readiness, medical logistics were readiness, proper evacuation was readiness, trained nurses were readiness, preventive medicine was readiness. The Spanish-American War helped force an army that wanted to operate overseas to understand that fighting power depends not only on courage and weapons, but on the daily management of health. A regiment crippled by fever cannot fulfill its mission, no matter how brave its men. And yet the memory of the war itself did not change as much as the medical system did. Public culture continued to prefer its vivid scenes of combat. Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders remained central to the popular story. The destruction of the Spanish fleet stayed dramatic. The expansion of American power stayed politically consequential. The deaths from disease were acknowledged, investigated and recorded, but they never became the most familiar image of the conflict for ordinary memory. That is why it is worth returning to them now, not to erase the battles, but to place them beside the fever wards, where so much of the war's human cost truly unfolded. The war was not only won on hills and at sea, it was also redefined in hospitals, commissions, laboratories, and sanitation campaigns. If we stand back from the whole story, a strange pattern appears. The United States entered the Spanish-American War eager to prove its strength abroad, but one of the most important things it discovered was its weakness at home. Its camps were vulnerable, its medical department was too small, its transportation systems were clumsy. Its physicians knew more than previous generations, but not enough, and not always in time. Its commanders wanted quick action, but quick action without sanitary discipline became an invitation to disease. Those weaknesses did not erase the victory. They complicated it. They made the victory more costly than it needed to be, and they ensured that the war would leave behind not only new territories and new geopolitical responsibilities, but new expectations for how soldiers should be protected. The men who died of typhoid in American camps, the fever patients at Siboney, the soldiers carried home to Montauk, the nurses who worked through the night, the doctors who demanded more help than the system could provide, and the investigators who traced infection after the fact all belong to the same history. They're connected by a single lesson. Disease was not a regrettable background condition of war. It was one of war's central dangers, and in 1898 it proved more lethal than the declared enemy. The reforms that followed did not bring perfection, but they marked a turning point. From that point forward, the army had stronger reason to treat prevention as seriously as treatment, sanitation as seriously as supply, and the health of soldiers as something that could no longer be left to luck. So the fever did not end when the war ended. It continued in reports, in commissions, in new institutions, in experiments conducted in Cuba, in the creation of a nurse corps, in vaccination programs, and in every later military planner who understood that a camp can become as dangerous as a battlefield if no one is paying attention. That may be the most lasting legacy of the Spanish-American War's disease crisis. It changed what preparedness meant. It taught the army that protecting soldiers from preventable illness was not a kindness added after the real work of war. It was part of the real work itself. And for all the flags, charges and naval victories remembered from 1898, that quieter lesson may have been the one that mattered longest.